Hey, welcome back, friend. Get comfortable tonight. Pull that blanket up, settle into whatever soft corner you have claimed for yourself, and take a slow breath. Because I have a story for you that has been hiding inside the walls of some of the most beautiful buildings in the world for over 200 years. And it begins at 5 o'clock in the morning, in the dark, with a 13-year-old girl already on her knees. Here is the question I want you to carry with you tonight. Have you ever walked through a grand old mansion and wondered how it stayed so perfectly, impossibly beautiful? The fires always lit, the silver always gleaming, the rooms always warm and ready, as though the house simply maintained itself. It did not. And the people who actually made it happen were by design never supposed to be seen. Before we go any further, if this kind of quietly forgotten history is your thing, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button and gave this video a like. And tell me in the comments where in the world are you watching from right now? In bed, on the couch, somewhere unexpectedly cozy. I read every single one of those and they truly make my day. Now light soft fan on if you like a little gentle sound and let us begin. The year is around 1890. Somewhere in the English countryside there is a great house, 40 rooms, 6 fireplaces on the ground floor alone, a dining room table long enough to seat 30 people without anyone feeling crowded. The family who lives there wakes at 9 o'clock. By 9 the fires are crackling, the carpets are swept, the silver on the breakfast sideboard gleams under the morning light. Fresh flowers stand in the hallway vases. The whole house smells faintly of beeswax polish and good coal smoke. It is effortless. It is elegant. It is magic, except it is not magic at all. 4 hours earlier, a housemaid, let us call her Eliza, one of the most common names given to young servant girls in households of this period, was already moving through the dark, cold back passages of that house, carrying a coal scuttle and a box of matches. She had risen at 5, not because an alarm woke her, but because the kitchen range needed to be lit, and if it was not lit, the water would not boil, and if the water did not boil, the cook could not begin, and if the cook couldn't begin, the family's breakfast would be late, and if the family's breakfast was late, well, you can imagine. Here is something that stops me every time I think about it. In the 19th century, domestic service was not a niche occupation. It was the single largest employer of women in all of Britain. By the early 1900s, 1.5 million people worked as domestic servants in England. 1.5 million, most of them women, many of them girls, some as young as 13 or 14. Historians estimate that during the height of this era, roughly 1 in every 4 working people in the country was in some form of domestic service. These were not background characters, they were the majority, and almost none of them left diaries, almost none were painted, almost none were interviewed. The histories of great houses almost always tell you about the family. The lord's business dealings, the lady's social calendar, the parties, the scandals. The girls who kept the whole thing running invisible, by design. Let me walk you through what Eliza's morning actually looked like. 5 o'clock she rises from her narrow bed in the attic, unheated, shared with 2 other maids, breaks the thin layer of ice that has sometimes formed in her wash basin overnight, and is downstairs, cap straight and apron tied within 30 minutes. First task, stoke the kitchen range back to a working heat from the night's embers, rake the cold ash, relay the grate, coax the fire up, then, and this is the part that tends to shock modern people, empty and clean the chamber pots of the other female servants, because even among the servants themselves there was a hierarchy, and the girl at the very bottom was the one who started the day with everyone else's chamber pots. We will spend a great deal of time with that hierarchy in the next part of this story. But for now, by 6 o'clock, Eliza begins what was called the opening of the house. She moves from room to room. The drawing room, the dining room, the library, the morning room, the study, pulling back curtains, raking fireplaces, laying fresh fires, and sweeping the carpets with damp tea leaves. Yes, used tea leaves, saved from the day before, scattered across the carpet to collect the dust and dirt, then swept up. It sounds strange, but it worked remarkably well. It was also, if we are honest, deeply unglamorous labour, and she had to finish all of it, every room on the ground floor, before the family came down at 9. 4 hours, no electric light, no vacuum cleaner, no heated water on tap, just her hands and her legs, and those back staircases she climbed over and over again. Here is the detail I find most quietly devastating. Eliza had to be invisible while doing all of this. If a member of the family appeared unexpectedly, got up early, came downstairs at 8 in the morning, she was expected to step back, lower her eyes, and wait in silence until they passed. No speaking unless spoken to, no eye contact. She was for all intents and purposes part of the furniture. One housemaid who worked in a large English country estate in the 1880s wrote late in her life that after months in service she had become so skilled at making herself disappear that she began to feel, in her own words, like a shadow that the house had grown. A shadow that the house had grown. Now you might be wondering, why did they do it? Why did girls as young as 13 leave their families and enter this kind of life? And the honest answer is because in that world this was one of the better options. It was not easy, it was not glamorous, but it meant a roof, it meant food, it meant a small but steady wage, typically between £12 and £18 per year, which was very little but more than nothing, and it meant just barely the possibility of moving up. A girl who started as a scullery maid could, with years of work and good references, eventually become a kitchen maid, then a housemaid, then perhaps a lady's maid. The records at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, one of England's great estates home to the Dukes of Devonshire, actually document this kind of journey. A young woman named Rose Burden started as a scullery maid at one of the family's houses in 1867. By 1871 she'd been promoted to kitchen maid. 4 years of scrubbing pots in the coldest, dampest room in the house, and she had climbed one rung. That was the ladder. Small, slow, uncertain, but it was there. And there was something else too. Something that tends to get overlooked when we look back at this world from the outside. Many of the women who spent years in great houses developed a deep, genuine sense of ownership over them. Not legal ownership, of course, but intimate knowledge of a place that you have cared for with your own hands every single day. There are memoirs from former servants who wrote decades after leaving service about houses like Chatsworth or Longleat as their house. They knew where the drafts came through in winter. They knew which floor tiles were loose. They knew that the guest bedroom fireplace on the east wing always smoked when the wind was from the north, and you had to prop the window open just a crack to help the drawer. The family drifted through those rooms. The servant girls knew every inch of them. So let us close part 1 here with Eliza. It is 9 o'clock. The house is warm. The fires are lit. The dining room smells of coffee and fresh bread. The family is descending the grand staircase. They step into the drawing room and notice in some comfortable, half-conscious way that it looks exactly as it always does. Perfect, ordered, beautiful. They do not think about it. They do not need to. Eliza is already back up the back stairs, already moving to the next task. Already invisible, but here is what we've not yet talked about. Eliza was not alone in that house. There was an entire world behind those walls, a world with its own rules, its own rigid hierarchy, its own politics, that could be just as sharp and surprising as anything happening in the drawing room above. And in this world where you stood in the pecking order could determine almost everything about your life, what you ate, where you slept, whether you were treated with a scrap of dignity or none at all. Coming up next, we step through that hidden door, and what we find on the other side is stranger and more human than you might expect. Still with me, good? Because what I am about to tell you is the part of this story that most history books skip entirely. We spent part 1 watching the house wake up from the outside, that long, quiet, invisible labour before the family opened their eyes. But now I want to take you somewhere the family almost never went. Down. Below the grand rooms, below the carpeted staircases and the portrait galleries and the dining room with its 30-seat table, there was another house entirely. And it had its own world, its own rules, its own royalty, and its own way of making your life very, very comfortable or absolutely miserable, depending entirely on where you landed within it. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you are 15 years old. You've just arrived at a great house, one of the large country estates of Victorian England, for your very first day in service. You come through the servants' entrance at the side of the house, which is the only door you will ever use. You're carrying a small wooden box that holds your 2 work dresses, your spare apron, a pair of worn shoes, and if you were lucky, a small Bible your mother pressed into your hands before you left home. That box is quite literally everything you own. A senior housemaid leads you down a narrow stone staircase into the basement, and suddenly you're standing in a completely different world. The servants' hall, a long plain room with wooden benches and a scrub table, is where the household staff takes their meals together. The walls are painted a utilitarian grey. There are no portraits here, no fine curtains, no polished floors, and yet this room has a seating arrangement so strict, so precisely observed that sitting in the wrong chair could earn you a sharp look that you would feel for the rest of the week. Where you sat at that table told everyone exactly who you were. Let me walk you through the structure, because it is genuinely fascinating. At the very top of the below-stairs world sat 2 figures who were in their own domain, as powerful as any lord or lady above. The butler who managed everything to do with the male staff, the wine cellar, the silver and the formal dining service, and the housekeeper who managed everything else. The housekeeper in particular is someone I think deserves far more attention than history usually gives her. She was typically a woman of middle age who had spent decades climbing through the ranks of service. She held the keys to every locked room in the house, literally physically, on a heavy iron ring that hung from her waist, and rang softly when she walked so that you always heard her coming. That sound of keys was the sound of authority. She controlled access to the linen stores, the china cupboards, the cleaning supplies, the still-room provisions. She kept the household accounts. She hired and dismissed the female staff. She approved or denied requests for days off. In a large estate, she had her own private sitting room, a genuine luxury in that world where she took her meals separately from the rest of the staff sometimes, along with the butler, the lady's maid and the valet, in a smaller arrangement sometimes called the upper servants' table, or in grander houses the pug's parlour. Yes, that was really what it was called in some households, the pug's parlour. I find that name quietly delightful. Now, beneath the housekeeper and the butler, things got considerably more interesting. The lady's maid, personal attendant to the mistress of the house, occupied a strange and often uncomfortable middle position. She ate with the upper servants, she dressed well, she travelled with the family when they went to London or to the continent. But she was also deeply vulnerable in a way that the housekeeper was not. Her position depended entirely on staying in the personal favour of one woman. We will explore that particular relationship in much more depth later in this story because it is genuinely one of the most complex, emotionally loaded dynamics in the entire below-stairs world. Then came the cook, who technically ranked below the lady's maid in the formal hierarchy, but wielded enormous practical power because quite simply she fed everyone. A good cook was almost impossible to replace, and she knew it. Below the cook, the kitchen maids, the housemaids, the laundry maids, the nursemaid, the still-room maid, the between-stairs maid, sometimes called the tweenie, because she worked between the upstairs and downstairs worlds, belonging fully to neither. And at the very bottom, the scullery maid, the girl who started every morning before anyone else in the coldest room in the house with her hands in water so hot it turned her skin red. But we have a whole dedicated part of this story set aside just for her, and when we get there, I promise you will not forget it. Here is the thing about this hierarchy that I find so unexpectedly human. It was not simply about who did harder work or who earned more money. It was about something much older and much more recognizable. It was about dignity. In a world where every person in that basement had been stripped of most of the markers of social worth, they had no property, often no education, sometimes not even their own names rank within the servants' hall, became the primary currency of self-respect. An experienced housemaid who had been in service for 8 years would not sweep a floor if it was a scullery maid's job to sweep it. A lady's maid would not carry coal. A cook would not wash dishes, not because they thought themselves too grand, but because to blur those lines was to give up the only distinction they had. It was in a small and very human way the same impulse that drives people at every level of society to hold tightly to whatever status marker they possess. We have not changed as much as we think we have. Now there was a figure in this hierarchy that I want to spend a moment with because I think she is one of the most overlooked and genuinely fascinating people in the entire story of great houses. The tweenie, the between-stairs maid. She earned roughly £13 per year, one of the lowest wages in the house. She worked according to contemporary household management records 7 days a week, from 5 in the morning until 10 at night. Her job was to assist whichever senior servant needed help most urgently on any given day, which sounds flexible but in practice meant she was everyone's last resort and nobody's priority. She carried the coal that the housemaids needed but were too busy to fetch. She cleaned the rooms that the scullery maid had not yet reached. She answered the bell when the lady's maid was occupied. She laid fires that the kitchen maid had not had time to reach. She existed, in essence, to fill the gaps that a perfectly run household was not supposed to have. And precisely because she was everywhere and permanent to nowhere, she's almost impossible to trace in the historical record. But she was there, in every large house, every single day. Something I want to ask you, and I am genuinely curious about this. When you imagine life in a grand Victorian country house, what does the below-stairs world look like to you? Do you picture something like Downton Abbey, a warm kitchen, the cook ruling over her domain with good-natured firmness servants who genuinely liked each other and looked out for one another because that version is not entirely wrong? There was warmth. There was genuine community. People who worked together for years, who shared their small rooms and their half-days off, and their Sunday afternoons. But there was also something harder, something the television dramas tend to soften, and that is the degree to which the people at the bottom of this hierarchy were genuinely vulnerable to the moods, the whims, and sometimes the cruelty of those above them. In the servants' hall, the housekeeper had almost total authority over the female staff. A woman in the historical record named Hannah Culwick, whose diaries are now held at Trinity College in Cambridge, and who worked as a maid-of-all-work in various English households through the mid-19th century, wrote with remarkable frankness about the reality of life under a difficult housekeeper. She described going entire days without speaking to another person. She described being assigned the most humiliating tasks not because they were necessary, but as a kind of reminder of where she stood. She described a housekeeper who, when displeased, would simply stop acknowledging a lower maid's existence, not dismissing her, not reprimanding her, just looking through her as though she were not there at all. which in the language of the below-stairs world was its own very precise form of punishment. Hannah's diaries are extraordinary documents. She wrote them in secret late at night by candlelight after her work was done, and reading them today you're struck by how vividly alive she is on the page, funny, perceptive, furious, tender, observant, when the world she lived in had been designed to make her invisible. The geography of the great house itself was engineered to enforce this hierarchy. This is something worth slowing down for because it reveals so much about how deliberately this world was constructed. In the large country estates of England, the house was not just divided between upstairs and downstairs in a loose metaphorical sense. It was architecturally separated. The servants' entrance was on the side or the rear of the house, never the front. The back staircase ran parallel to the main staircase, accessed through an unmarked door that blended into the wall panelling. The kitchen, the laundry, the scullery, the servants' hall, all of this occupied a largely subterranean world of stone floors and low ceilings and gas lamps entirely separate from the carpeted, portrait-hung, chandelier-lit world above. In many of the great houses of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, the passages connecting the service areas were specifically designed so that servants could move through the entire building without ever crossing the path of the family. The house was, in architectural terms, two houses sharing one set of walls. One house for the people who owned it, one house for the people who ran it, and the two worlds were never supposed to meet unless the family specifically summoned someone from below. There is one more detail about this hidden world that I think is worth sitting with before we move on, and it is something that once you know it changes how you see these houses entirely. In many large estates, the male and female servants were housed in completely separate parts of the building. The male staff, footmen, hallboys, the butler himself slept in the basement or in adjacent outbuildings. The female staff, all the housemaids, kitchen maids, the ladies' maids slept in the attic. 4 flights of stairs between them minimum, and the rules around contact between the male and female servants were extraordinarily strict. Male servants were not permitted in the attic corridor. Female servants were not permitted in the basement staff rooms. Any romantic connection between servants of the same household was strongly discouraged, often explicitly prohibited. Any maid found to have a follower, the term used for a romantic attachment outside the house, could be dismissed immediately. The logic behind these rules was framed in terms of maintaining order and propriety, but the effect was something starker. It meant that the young women who worked in these houses, many of them teenagers away from their families for the first time in an unfamiliar place with no privacy and almost no free time, were also systematically isolated from any form of personal connection. They could not have a sweetheart. They could not marry without leaving service. They could not easily make friends outside the house. Their social world was in almost every sense the walls of that building and the people inside it, and the housekeeper held the keys. So that is the world we've been dropped into, a world that looks from the outside like the orderly, invisible engine of a perfectly run English household. But from the inside, from the servants' hall, from the back staircases, from the cold attic rooms where the maids slept 4 flights above the family they served, it was something far more layered, a complete human world with its own pride, its own politics, its own small kindnesses, and its own capacity for loneliness. And within that world there was one corner so cold, so physically demanding, so deliberately forgotten by everyone above and around it, that it deserves a part of this story entirely to itself. Coming up next, we go to the place that most people in the great house never visited. The room at the back of the kitchen where the water was always cold, the floor was always wet, and the girl who worked there was almost always the youngest person in the building. That room had a name, and the girl who worked in it was the foundation on which everything elegant above her rested. That room had a name, the scullery, And if you've never heard of it before, do not worry, most people have not. That is in a way exactly the point. The scullery was tucked at the very back of the kitchen wing, past the main cooking area, past the larder where the meat hung in the cold, past the pastry room, past the plate room where the silver was stored. It was quite deliberately the furthest point from anything the family would ever see or touch. It was not beautiful. It had stone floors that were almost always wet. It had a single deep sink called a scullery sink made of stone or rough ceramic, wide enough to hold the largest pots and pans in the kitchen. The walls were bare plaster, often damp. There was no fireplace in the scullery itself. In winter, the cold came up through the stone floor and settled into your bones while you stood there working. And it was in this room, cold damp, smelling perpetually of lye soap and boiled vegetable water, that the youngest girl in the house spent most of her waking life. I want to tell you about a girl named Maud. Maud was 14 years old when she entered service as a scullery maid at a large house in Shropshire in the 1890s. We know about her not because she kept a diary, she almost certainly had no time for that, but because decades later, already an old woman, she gave an interview to a local historical society that was collecting memories of domestic service. And what she described in that interview is, I think, one of the most honest windows we have into what this particular life was actually like. She said that in her first week she cried every night. Not because anyone was cruel to her, though she was careful to note that nobody was kind to her either, but because she had genuinely not understood before she arrived what the work would feel like in the body. She said her hands had never been in hot water for more than a few minutes at a time before she entered service. Within 3 days of starting, the skin on her hands was cracked and raw from constant immersion in water laced with washing soda and lye soap. The lye soap was the hard caustic kind, the kind that could blister unprotected skin if you were not careful. She was not careful at first, because she did not know she needed to be. Nobody told her. Let us talk about what a scullery maid actually did in concrete terms, because I think the reality of it deserves to be spoken plainly. She rose before anyone else in the kitchen, typically between 5 and 5:30 in the morning. Her first task was to relight the kitchen range from the banked embers of the night before, because the kitchen maid and cook needed heat by the time they arrived. This mirrors what we discussed with the housemaids upstairs, but in the scullery maid's case it was the starting gun for a sequence of labour that would not stop for the next 16 or 17 hours. Once the range was going, she would begin heating water. Water for the cook, water for the kitchen maid, water for the household's morning tea service. And then the washing would begin. The pots from the evening before, the enormous copper stock pots, the roasting pans caked with dripping and burnt residue, the baking sheets, the pudding moulds, the dozens upon dozens of plates and serving dishes from the family's dinner the previous night. All of it had accumulated overnight waiting for her, and once she'd finished the washing from last night, today's cooking would begin, which meant today's mess was already starting to build. The scullery maid was in the most literal sense always behind. She was always chasing a level of clean that was being undone faster than she could achieve it. Now here is something that I think modern people find genuinely difficult to picture. We're used to the idea of hot running water. You turn a tap and there it is. In a Victorian great house there was no such thing. Every single drop of hot water in that building had to be heated on the kitchen range and then carried by hand in heavy iron or copper vessels to wherever it was needed. Think about what that means for a house with 40 rooms, a household with a family of 5, 3 or 4 guests and a staff of perhaps 20. Everyone needing hot water to wash their faces in the morning, everyone needing hot water for the kitchen throughout the day. The laundry needing gallons of near-boiling water every week. The family needing hot water for their evening baths carried up in large tin cans to the dressing rooms on the first floor. Much of that water was heated in the scullery. and much of it was carried by the scullery maid. One account from a household management manual of the 1880s estimated that a scullery maid in a large house might carry the equivalent of 300 pounds of water per day in separate loads up various flights of stairs. 300 pounds per day. That is not a metaphor for hard work. That is a clinical description of physical labour that would exhaust a trained athlete. And Maud was 14 years old. Something that strikes me every time I think about this particular corner of history, and I mean this sincerely, is how completely the scullery maid was rendered invisible even within the invisible world. We talked in part 2 about how the female servants were hidden from the family by the architecture of the house itself. The back staircases, the service corridors, the servants' entrance. But even within the servants' hierarchy, the scullery maid occupied a position of such low status that she was sometimes excluded from the small social rituals that gave the below-stairs world its sense of community. She did not in many houses eat at the servants' hall table with the rest of the staff. She ate in the kitchen or in the scullery itself because she needed to keep an eye on whatever was still cooking or soaking. She was not served first at meal times. She was served last, or she ate whatever remained after everyone else had finished. She was the only servant in the house that even Mrs. Beeton, the famous Victorian author of the Book of Household Management, who was not generally known for excessive sympathy toward the working class, described as deserving of genuine compassion. In that book, published in 1861, Mrs. Beeton wrote that, of all the servants in a great house, the scullery maid was the one whose lot she found most pitiable. She described the scullery maid's life as a solitary one, noted that her work was never truly done, and observed that she was subject to rougher treatment than any of the other staff. Coming from a writer who believed firmly that the servant class existed to serve, and that complaining about one's station was a moral failing, that is a remarkable statement. It was not quite sympathy, but it was something close to acknowledgement. And in the world of the scullery maid, acknowledgement was rare. Can I share something with you that I think is genuinely one of the most powerful fragments of evidence from this whole period? The wage books from Chatsworth House, which I mentioned briefly in part 1 in a different context, contain entries for scullery maids that go back to the middle of the 17th century. Most of the entries are just a name, a date of hire, a date of departure, and a wage. No age, no place of origin, no record of what happened to them afterward. Elizabeth Bent hired in 1659, gone within the year. Ellen Brown, 1858, 1 year. Mary Hutchings, 1865, 4 years. Name after name, year after year, across more than 2 centuries. Most of them stayed for 1 or 2 years before disappearing from the record entirely. Where did they go? Some moved up as Rose Burden did to kitchen maid eventually. Some left service altogether, perhaps to marry or return to their families. Some ended up in circumstances far worse. We will get to that later in this story. But here is what strikes me most about these wage book entries. The house is still standing. Chatsworth is one of the most visited historic houses in England. Tourists walk through its staterooms every year, marvelling at the paintings, the tapestries, the marble floors, the sheer scale of its beauty. And on every single one of those days, across every single one of those centuries, someone like Elizabeth Bent or Ellen Brown or Mary Hutchings was in the scullery at the back of the kitchen wing. Cracked hands, wet floor, heating the water that made all of it possible. And nobody put their name on a plaque. The physical toll of scullery work deserves more attention than it usually gets in historical accounts, so let us stay with it for a moment. The combination of constant wet work, harsh cleaning agents, and cold stone floors produced a very specific set of physical problems that were almost universal among scullery maids. The hands were the most visible sign, red cracked, sometimes bleeding at the knuckles in cold weather. the skin between the fingers could become so damaged that it would not fully heal during the working week. Some girls developed what was then called house eczema, a persistent skin condition brought on by the combination of lye soap washing soda and constant water exposure. We would recognize it immediately today as occupational contact dermatitis. There was also the problem of the floors. In the scullery, the floor was wet for most of the day. To deal with this scullery, maids in the better-run houses were given what were called slatted wooden boards, essentially a kind of raised wooden mat to stand on while they worked, which kept their feet slightly off the wet stone. In less generous households they were given nothing. Chilblains' painful swellings caused by repeated exposure to cold and damp were common. Respiratory problems from the kitchen steam and damp walls were documented. Back pain from bending over that deep stone sink hour after hour was essentially universal. There were no workplace protections for domestic servants, no unions, no sick pay, no compensation if you were injured on the job. If you were too unwell to work, you were likely to be dismissed. And dismissal, as we will explore more deeply in a later part of this story, was a genuinely terrifying prospect for reasons that went far beyond simply losing a job. And yet, there is something in Maud's interview, something in the accounts left by women who survived this life and looked back at it that is not simply suffering. There is something else too. Maud said something in that interview that I have thought about many times since I first read it. She said that the scullery, as grim as it was also the only place in the entire house that was truly hers. Nobody came to inspect it the way they inspected the upstairs rooms. Nobody cared if there was a small chip in the stone sink, or if she'd arranged her cleaning rags in a particular way, or if she had quietly started keeping a small pot of rosemary on the windowsill because she liked the smell of it. It was the most forgotten corner of the house, and precisely because it was forgotten, it was also the one space where she could in the smallest possible way be herself. She said it took her 2 years to realize that, but once she did, she told the interviewer, the scullery stopped feeling like a punishment. It started feeling like a sanctuary. I find that quietly extraordinary. The room designed to disappear her had by accident of its own neglect given her the one thing nobody had thought to take away, a small, cold, perpetually damp corner of the world that was hers. Before we move on, I want to pause and ask you something. Is there a place in your own life, maybe not as dramatic as a Victorian scullery obviously, but a corner, a room, a particular chair or window or time of day, that is just yours? A small sanctuary that the rest of the world walks right past without noticing. If there is, I think you understand something that Maud understood in her own way. The value of a space that the world has forgotten to claim. One last thing before we leave the scullery behind for now. I mentioned that the scullery maid was the first to rise and one of the last to sleep, but I want to give you the full shape of her day just once, so it sits in your understanding of everything that follows. 5 in the morning she is lighting the range. By 7 she has already washed the servants' breakfast dishes and begun heating water for the family's morning routine upstairs. By 9 she is washing the breakfast things from the servants' hall and assisting the kitchen maid with food preparation for the family's luncheon. In the afternoon there is a theoretical hour of leisure, usually between 2:30 and 3:30, that existed on paper in most household management guides of the period. Whether it actually materialized in practice depended entirely on the cook's mood and the demands of the day. By 4 in the afternoon she's laying the servants' hall table for tea. By 4:30 she's washing up after tea. Through the early evening she's beside the kitchen maid again, washing every pot and pan used in preparation for the family's dinner, which was the grandest meal of the day, potentially 7 or 8 courses a production, that filled the kitchen with dishes and pans and mess on a scale that makes a domestic kitchen today look almost laughably simple. After the family's dinner was served, usually sometime between 8 and 9 in the evening, she would clean the kitchen passages, the pantries, the scullery, and the kitchen itself. Supper for the servants was served at 9:30, and if all of that was done, she was free from 9:30 until bed. That was her day, 6 days a week, with perhaps every other Sunday afternoon to herself, if she was lucky. We will come back to the scullery. We will come back to Maud and to the many girls like her whose names are preserved in wage books, but whose lives are almost entirely invisible to history. But right now, I want to take you somewhere else in the great house, somewhere considerably higher up in the hierarchy, somewhere that looks from the outside like one of the most desirable positions a young woman in service could hope for: a private sitting room, fine clothes, the closest access to the family of any servant in the building, travel to London, to Paris, to the great houses of the European continent. The position of the lady's maid had everything that the scullery had not: status, comfort, proximity to power. And as we're about to discover, it also had a particular kind of danger that the scullery maid in her cold, forgotten corner was entirely spared. Right? So we have been in the cold, wet depths of the scullery for a little while now, and before we go any further, I want to take a breath with you. Because the story shifts here. We are going up the back staircase, past the kitchen corridor, past the servants' hall, past the housekeeper's sitting room, all the way to a different part of the building. A part that has carpet on the floor, a part that has a small fireplace that actually works, a part where the windows look out onto the formal garden instead of the coal yard. We're going to the lady's maid's room, and I want to say something before we get there because I think it matters. For most of the girls who entered domestic service in Victorian and Edwardian England, the position of lady's maid was as close to an aspirational dream as this world allowed. It meant status. It meant comfort, relative comfort anyway. It meant being seen in a way that the scullery maid never was. And yet, the closer you look at this role, the more you realize that what appeared to be the most desirable position in the house was also in certain very specific ways the most precarious, the most exposed, and the loneliest. Let us start with what a lady's maid actually was. She was in the simplest terms the personal servant of the mistress of the house, the lady of the family. Every great house that could afford one had one, and in the wealthiest households there might be a lady's maid for the mistress, and a separate one for each of the adult daughters of the house. Her responsibilities were intimate in a way that set her apart from every other servant. She helped her mistress dress and undress. She arranged her hair every morning and took it down every evening. She cared for her wardrobe cleaning, mending, pressing, altering, organizing. She helped her mistress prepare for social engagements, balls, dinners, country house visits, and the long London season. She accompanied her wherever she travelled. She was in the truest sense the person who stood closest to the woman at the centre of the household's social world, and that proximity, that extraordinary degree of physical and personal closeness, was both the privilege and the trap. To understand why you need to understand something about how the lady's maid was selected and trained. Unlike the housemaids or the kitchen maids who could be hired young and inexperienced and taught on the job, the lady's maid was expected to arrive already skilled. She needed to know how to dress hair in the current fashionable style, which changed with remarkable speed in the Victorian and Edwardian eras and required real technical knowledge and constant learning. She needed to understand fine textiles, silk, satin, velvet, lace, muslin, how to clean each one without damage, how to press them without leaving marks, how to repair tears so that the repair was invisible. She needed to speak, if not with perfect refinement, then at least without anything that would embarrass her mistress in front of guests. She might need basic French because the fashionable world communicated in French, and many of the dressmakers, milliners and couturiers her mistress dealt with were French, or presented themselves as such. In short, she needed to be more educated, more polished, and more culturally fluent than almost any other servant in the house. And she was paid for it. A skilled lady's maid in a great English household in the 1880s could earn between £25 and £40 per year, substantially more than a housemaid, and in some cases more than a cook. She received gifts of her mistress's cast-off clothing, which, given that aristocratic women changed outfits multiple times per day and replaced their wardrobes seasonally, could amount to a genuinely valuable collection of fine garments. She had her own room, usually on the bedroom floor rather than the attic. She had access to a different quality of life than almost anyone else below stairs. And now for the part that nobody tells you. The lady's maid also had precisely one source of job security. One, not her skills, not her experience, not the years she'd given to the house, the continued personal favour of her mistress. That was it. If the mistress of the house liked her, trusted her, felt comfortable with her, she was safe. The moment that changed for any reason or no reason at all, she was gone. There was a phrase used in household management guides of the period dismissed without a character that I want to explain because it does not mean what it sounds like to modern ears. A character was not a personality trait. It was a written reference, a letter from your previous employer, confirming that you had been honest, reliable, and competent. Without it, finding another position in service was almost impossible. The employment system for domestic servants in Victorian England operated almost entirely on these personal references. Agencies required them. Private households required them. Without a character, you were for practical purposes unemployable in the only field you had trained for. And a lady's maid who was dismissed for whatever reason could not simply demand a character reference. Her mistress could choose not to provide one, or she could provide a lukewarm one which was almost as damaging. Or she could provide one that was technically accurate but strategically incomplete, noting the maid's competence at hairdressing, while conspicuously failing to mention her years of loyal service. This was not a theoretical risk. It happened regularly, and the reasons it happened were sometimes so arbitrary that they beggar belief. Let me tell you about a woman named Rosina Harrison. Rosina Harrison was one of the most famous ladies' maids of the 20th century. She served Lady Nancy Astor, the first woman to take a seat in the British Parliament for 35 years. She wrote a memoir late in her life that was published in 1975, and it remains one of the most candid accounts of the ladies' maids world that we have. What makes Rosina's account so valuable is not just that she served one of the most powerful women in England for 3.5 decades. It is the texture of what she describes. She writes about the absolute unpredictability of her mistress's moods. Lady Astor was brilliant, charming, deeply committed to her political work, and also capable of being, in Rosina's own words, the most difficult woman on earth, without any warning whatsoever. Rosina describes mornings where she would arrive to dress Lady Astor's hair and find her in perfect good humour, chatty, warm, interested in Rosina's own opinions, and mornings where she would arrive to find a wall of cold silence and anything she did or said would be wrong, and the best possible strategy was to become as close to invisible as possible until the mood passed. Sound familiar? For Rosina, the key to surviving 35 years in that position was learning to read her mistress the way a sailor reads the weather. Not just the obvious signs, but the small ones. The angle of the shoulders, the way she held the newspaper, the particular silence that meant irritation versus the silence that simply meant concentration. It was Rosina wrote a form of knowledge that took years to develop and could never be fully taught to someone else. And here is the thing that gets me. Rosina was brilliant at her job. By any measure, longevity, loyalty, the genuine affection her mistress eventually developed for her, she was extraordinary. And she spent 35 years in a position where on any given morning, Her entire professional future could have been ended by a bad hairstyle or an ill-timed word. That is not a comfortable way to live, even when it is comfortable. Now the intimacy of the lady's maid's position created another dynamic that is worth understanding. Because she was physically present during the most private moments of her mistress's day, the dressing and undressing, the morning toilette, the quiet conversations before a ball, a lady's maid inevitably learned things. Private things. The kind of things a woman might never say aloud to her husband, her mother, her closest friends. She saw the letters that arrived with unfamiliar handwriting. She noticed when her mistress cried in her dressing room. She was present when the family doctor made a discreet visit. She knew about the debt sometimes. She knew about the affairs sometimes. She knew which marriages in the great houses of England were genuinely happy and which were performances, and she was expected to know all of this and to act as though she knew nothing. The discretion required of a lady's maid was not just an expectation, it was a survival skill. A maid who gossiped even slightly, even within the servants' hall, risked everything. A maid who was indiscreet outside the house risked something considerably worse. There are cases in the historical record of ladies' maids who became embroiled in the scandals of their mistresses, not because they had done anything wrong themselves, but simply because they had been present when the wrong things happened. One particularly striking example comes from the 1880s, involving a society household in London whose mistress was discovered to be conducting an extended correspondence with a man who was not her husband. The lady's maid had carried some of those letters, not knowingly necessarily, but she had carried them. When the scandal broke, the lady's maid was dismissed within the week. She'd done nothing morally wrong. She'd done nothing the household would have permitted her to refuse. But she had been present, and presence in this world was sometimes enough to make you guilty by association. There is something that I keep returning to when I think about the lady's maid's position, and it is this: she was the only servant in the house who was genuinely expected to have a relationship with her employer. Not a friendship, the class divide was always there, always enforced, but something more than the purely functional arrangement that governed every other role in the house. The cook fed the family, the housemaids maintained the building, the scullery maid kept the kitchen running, but the lady's maid was expected to understand her mistress, her moods, her preferences, her anxieties, the specific curve of her hairline, and the best way to disguise it, the colours that made her look well and the ones that made her look tired. She was expected to care in a professional way that had to stop just short of genuine attachment, because genuine attachment was dangerous. Genuine attachment meant you might feel entitled to consideration, and entitlement was something a lady's maid could not afford. Let me give you a sense of the physical reality of the job, because I think it is easy to romanticize it if we focus only on the fine clothes and the private room. On a typical morning before a formal engagement, a lady's maid might spend 2 hours on her mistress's hair alone. In the Victorian era, fashionable hairstyles were architectural in their complexity. Coils, curls, crimps, pads, switches, pieces of false hair used to add volume hairpins by the dozen pomades, setting lotions, and the curling tongs that were heated directly in the flames of a small gas burner or oil lamp. Those tongs, if left in the flame a moment too long, could scorch the hair, and a scorched piece of hair on the morning of an important dinner or a presentation at court was a catastrophe that fell entirely on the lady's maid's shoulders, not just professionally. The cost of any damage to her mistress's wardrobe or appearance could be, and often was deducted from the lady's maid's wages. A torn dress, a scorched curl, a dress that came back from the cleaners in a slightly different shade because the maid had used the wrong cleaning agent. All of it could come out of her pay. She was responsible not just for her own labour, but for the material integrity of everything she touched. And she touched a great deal. So I want to ask you something, honestly. If you had been born into that world, into that specific time and that specific class, where domestic service was essentially the only respectable path available to a young woman without money or connections, which position would you have wanted the scullery maid's cold forgotten corner, which was entirely hers precisely because no one else wanted it, or the lady's maid's fine room and fine clothes and proximity to power, and the exhausting, never-ending performance of perfect discretion that came with it? I have thought about this question a surprising number of times, and I genuinely do not have a clear answer, because I think the honest truth is that both positions contained a particular kind of freedom and a particular kind of captivity, and neither one was the whole picture. The lady's maid's story does not end here. We're going to come back to her when we talk about the rules that govern the personal lives of all servant women, the rules about marriage, about friendship, about what was permitted and what was quietly forbidden. Because the lady's maid, for all her relative privilege, was subject to those rules too, in some ways more so. But right now there is another part of this story that I want to bring you into. Because we have spent time below stairs and in the bedroom corridor, and we have talked about the physical labour of keeping a great house running. But we have not yet talked about something that I think might genuinely surprise you. We have not talked about the names, specifically the names these girls were called, not the names they were given at birth, the names the family decided to give them instead. Because in many great houses, who you were when you arrived was considered somewhat beside the point. And what happened to a young woman's identity the moment she crossed through that servant's entrance is one of the quieter, stranger details of this whole world. That is where we're going next. There is a question I want to start with tonight. What is a name worth? Not in a philosophical sense, I mean practically, concretely. In the world of the great house, what did your name actually get you? The answer, it turns out, is almost nothing. And understanding why that was so tells you something profound about how this entire world was built. When a young girl arrived at the servants' entrance of a great house for the first time, and we're talking about the mid to late 19th century, now the height of this era, she brought with her a small wooden box. That box was the sum total of her portable life. Inside it, her work dresses, 2 or 3 at most, her spare apron, her undergarments, a pair of shoes, usually the ones she had worn to travel in, perhaps a Bible if her family was religious, perhaps a small photograph, though those were still rare and precious enough to be treated like jewels, perhaps a handkerchief that had belonged to her mother. That box represented everything she owned outright, everything she had earned or been given that belonged purely to her. And then she stepped through the door. And in many households across Victorian and Edwardian England, within her first week of service, something happened that we would find almost incomprehensible today. She was renamed. Let me explain what I mean, because it was not always as dramatic as it sounds, and yet in some ways it was more unsettling than a dramatic act would have been. It was ordinary. That is what made it so strange. In the great houses of England, certain families had a long-standing custom of giving their servants standard interchangeable names, particularly their housemaids, regardless of what those girls were actually called. All the housemaids in some households were called Mary, in others they were all Jane, in others Anne or Eliza or Betsy. The reason was on its face practical. A family that employed 3 or 4 housemaids who rotated through identical duties did not want to have to remember 4 individual names. If the housemaid who appeared in the drawing room was always called Mary, then it did not matter which specific girl was standing there on any given morning. They were all Mary. They were interchangeable. And therefore, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, they were not quite individuals. Now, I should say that this practice was not universal. There were households where servants were called by their actual given names, or at least by their surnames, which was the standard form of address for more senior staff. The housekeeper was always Mrs., even if she had never been married, which was often the case. That honorific was a mark of her rank, a title she had earned through years of service. The butler was always Mr., followed by his surname. But a housemaid, a kitchen maid, a tweeny first name only if she was lucky, or a name the family preferred, or in some cases just her role, the kitchen girl, the little maid, the under-housemaid. When the Victorian census takers made their rounds every 10 years, the records they produced are a remarkable document of how completely this erasure had taken hold. In the 1851 census, in the 1861 census, in the 1871 census, household after household lists its servants with only a first name and an occupation. Mary housemaid aged 16, Jane kitchen maid aged 14, Anne scullery maid aged 13. No surnames, no places of birth sometimes, no family connections noted. Just a name, possibly not even their own, and a function. That is the historical record. That is all that remains of them in most cases. Something I think about when I look at those census pages is the question of letters. These girls had left their families. They had left their villages, their parishes, their communities. Many of them had come to large cities, to London, to Manchester, to Edinburgh, from the countryside, from small towns in Wales or the Midlands or the north of England, and they communicated with home by letter, or they tried to. But here is something that is rarely discussed in histories of domestic service. In many households, the letters that arrived for servants, and sometimes the letters servants tried to send, passed through the hands of the housekeeper, or even the mistress of the house. Not always, not in every household, but often enough that it was an acknowledged feature of the world. A letter from home arriving at the servant's entrance might be delivered promptly and unopened, or it might sit in the housekeeper's room until she decided it was a convenient time to distribute the post, or, and this is documented in memoirs from the period, it might be quietly read, before being passed on the grounds that the household had a right to know what kind of information was flowing in and out through its servants. The reasoning was never stated quite so baldly, but the effect was unmistakable. A girl's correspondence with her family, the only connection she had to the life she had come from, to the person she had been before she crossed that threshold, was not reliably private. In a world where you might have been given someone else's name, the letters were sometimes the only place your real name still appeared, and those too were not entirely yours. I want to bring in a different kind of servant now, because there was one figure in the great house whose experience of identity and belonging was, if anything, even more complicated than the housemaids, the governess. She was not quite a servant. She was not quite a member of the family. She existed in a no-man's land between the two worlds that was by almost every account from the period profoundly lonely. The governess was typically a woman of some education, often from a family that had fallen on hard times, a clergyman's daughter, a merchant's daughter, whose father had died and left nothing behind. She had knowledge and refinement that qualified her to teach the daughters of the house reading French music, drawing, needlework, the social arts. But she had no money, and in the Victorian world, money was the thing that transformed education and refinement into social standing. Without it, she was educated but poor, which meant she lived in the house, shared its physical comforts, a decent room, proper meals, inclusion in family prayers, but was excluded from the social life of both the drawing room and the servants' hall. The family regarded her as not quite their equal. The servants regarded her as not quite one of them. She belonged nowhere. Charlotte Brontë, who had worked as a governess herself before she published her novels, wrote in a private letter in the 1840s that a governess's position was one of isolated existence, a phrase that has stayed with me since I first read it. Isolated existence in a house full of people. Jane Eyre, which Brontë published in 1847, is in many ways the fictional portrait of this precise experience, a woman of intelligence and feeling trapped in the amber of a social position that neither valued her nor released her. And what makes Bronte's portrait so resonant, I think, is that she understood the particular cruelty of that in-between position. It was not the cruelty of the scullery. It was not physical. It was the cruelty of being present but not seen educated, but not valued present at the table but not a part of it. A different kind of invisibility from the housemaids, but invisibility nonetheless. Let me come back to the question of names, because there is one more angle to this that I find genuinely fascinating. The practice of national and regional prejudice in domestic service. When a family was looking to hire, they did not simply want a girl who could scrub floors or arrange hair. They had opinions about where that girl should come from, and those opinions were striking in their specificity. Scottish servants in the Victorian and Edwardian eras were considered the most desirable by many English households. They had a reputation not entirely fair, but genuinely held for being industrious, reliable, morally serious, and crucially less likely to give trouble. Welsh servants were considered respectable, but sometimes linguistically difficult if their English was uncertain. Irish servants occupied a far more complicated position. There was a term Bridget that became in the second half of the 19th century a generic name for Irish female domestic servants in both England and the United States, in much the same way that all English housemaids might be called Mary by their employers. It was not a compliment. It was a diminishment, the reduction of an entire national group to a single interchangeable serviceable identity. Irish women entered domestic service in enormous numbers after the catastrophic crop failures of the 1840s, which caused mass starvation and forced emigration on a scale that emptied entire parishes. They came to English cities and to American cities, and they went into service because it was one of the few forms of employment reliably available to a woman with no formal education and no connections in a city she had never seen before. And in both countries they were often regarded with a specific blend of condescension and suspicion, suspected of being too Catholic, too excitable, too politically unreliable, too loyal to each other, and therefore insufficiently loyal to their employers. The name Bridget carried all of that prejudice embedded within it. To call someone Bridget was to say, I see not a person but a category, which was, of course, exactly what the naming system in the great houses had always done. There is a detail that brings all of this home for me in a very specific way. In the servants' registries of Victorian London, the employment agencies that matched girls seeking positions with households seeking help, the intake forms sometimes asked for a girl's name, her age, her last place of employment, and her religion. Her religion, because certain households would not hire Catholics, others preferred them. Some had a preference for Church of England girls from the English countryside, believing them to be more settled and less likely to have outside loyalties. The girls who walked into those registry offices, into places like the large agencies on the Strand or in Bond Street, or the smaller, scruffier ones in Poplar or Bermondsey, were presenting themselves not merely as individuals looking for work. They were presenting their names, their origins, their religion, their bodies essentially, their entire selves, for assessment by a woman behind a desk, who would decide in a matter of minutes whether they were the kind of person a respectable household would want to admit through its servant's entrance. And if she decided they were not, there was no appeal. There was nowhere else to go in most cases, except to find a different registry with a less scrupulous intake process and less reassuring clients, which is a path that for some girls led somewhere considerably darker than a servants' hall. We will come to that part of the story a little later, but right now I want to end this part with something that feels to me like a small act of recovery. Because for all the erasure, for all the interchangeable Marys and the renamed Annes and the census entries that stripped girls down to a first name and a function, the names were not entirely lost. Some of them survive in unexpected places, in parish records, in letters that were kept decades later by the families that received them, in the oral histories collected by local historical societies in the 20th century, where elderly women, former servants themselves or daughters of servants, sat down and said her name was this. She came from this village, she worked in this house for 14 years, and this is what she told me about it. Those oral histories are scattered across archives in England and Scotland and Ireland and the United States. They are not famous. Nobody has made a television series about them, but they are there, and the women in them have their names, not the names they were given at the servants' entrance, their own names. There is a quiet, persistent truth running through everything we have talked about so far. The morning darkness, the scullery, the lady's maid's gilded cage, the interchangeable names. And that truth is this: the great house was built on the assumption that the people who ran it from the inside could be made in every meaningful sense to disappear. But human beings are not furniture. They have needs, they have relationships, they have desires that do not conveniently stop at the servant's entrance. And nowhere was that tension more visible, more raw, more painful, and more closely policed than in the rules governing who the servant girls were allowed to love. Coming up next, we look at one of the most intimate and controlling aspects of life in the great house: the rules around followers' marriage and the private lives of the women who kept these buildings running, because the great house did not merely want their labour, it wanted all of them. And what happened when a girl refused to give that is a story worth telling carefully. Something shifts in this part of the story. Up until now, we've been looking at the great house from a kind of careful distance, the work, the hierarchy, the rules of visibility, the slow erasure of identity. All of it deeply human, all of it worth sitting with. But here the story gets closer. Here we're talking about something that sits right at the intersection of power and the most private corners of a person's life. We're talking about what happened when a servant girl wanted simply to be loved. Every household had a version of it written somewhere. In the formal rules of large estates, it appeared in ink in the household regulations that new servants were sometimes required to read and acknowledge upon entry. In smaller households, it was simply understood, an unspoken contract enforced through the housekeeper's watchful eye and the mistress of the house's final authority. The rule was this: no followers. A follower, in the language of Victorian domestic service, meant any person of romantic interest outside the household. A young man who might write the kitchen maid a letter, a soldier who had met the housemaid at church on her half-day off and asked if he might walk with her, a shop assistant who had smiled at the parlour maid when she ran an errand in town. Any of these connections, if discovered, could be grounds for immediate dismissal. Not a warning, not a conversation. Dismissal. And the bluntness of that rule, the sheer totality of it, is something I want us to really sit with, because I think we can become numb to it if we say it too quickly and move on. These were young women, most of them teenagers or in their early 20s. They had left their families and their communities to come and work in someone else's house. They had almost no free time in the Victorian era. A half-day off on alternate Sundays was considered generous. They had no personal space to speak of sharing rooms with other servants in attic quarters that offered almost no privacy. And on top of all of that, the one thing that might have given them some emotional sustenance, a connection with someone outside the household, someone who knew their actual name and thought of them as a person rather than a function, was explicitly prohibited. I want to ask you something directly. Do you think that rule was really about maintaining order in the house, or do you think it was about something else? I do not ask that to be provocative. I ask it because when you read the household management guides of the period, Carefully, when you read the language used to justify the no-followers rule, what you find is revealing. The concern was not simply that a follower might distract a maid from her work. The concern was that a maid with a romantic attachment outside the house had somewhere to go. She had a person, she had an alternative, and a maid with an alternative was, from the perspective of household management, a maid who was harder to control. The enforcement of the no-followers rule took different forms in different households. In some houses, the housekeeper simply kept a close eye on the girls' movements during their rare free time and questioned them on their return. In others, it was more systematic. There are accounts in the historical record of housekeepers who required maids to report where they had gone on their half days, who they had spoken to, and whether they had been in the company of any men. In at least some households, receiving a letter with a man's handwriting on the envelope was enough to trigger a conversation, and depending on the housekeeper's mood, potentially more than that. And here is the detail that I find quietly monstrous. Under the legal and employment framework that governed domestic service throughout most of the 19th century, a servant had essentially no recourse. There was no contract in the modern sense. There was no employment tribunal. There was no formal appeal process. If the mistress of the house decided you had a follower or even suspected you might, she could dismiss you that same day, with no wages owed beyond what you had already earned, with no obligation to provide a written explanation, and if she chose not to give you a character reference, that all-important letter of recommendation that we touched on in Part 4, you were entering the world without the single document that proved you had been a trustworthy, employable person. The no-followers rule, in other words, was enforced not by any external law, but by the absolute power of dismissal. And dismissal for a young woman in this world was not just losing a job, it was losing everything. Let me tell you about a woman named Eliza Bollins. Eliza was 28 years old. She worked as a cook for two sisters, the Mrs. Cheetham of Chilwell in Nottinghamshire, in the spring of 1865. She was not a young girl fresh out of a village. She was a grown woman experienced in her work, presumably trusted enough to have been kept on for some time. And she had kept a secret. She was pregnant. We do not know who the father was. Eliza, by all accounts, took that information to her grave. On the morning of Sunday, April 9th, 1865, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Eliza's roommate, a fellow servant named Ellen Rillman, woke to find Eliza already up. She had lit the fire, she had partially dressed herself. Later that morning, Eliza had given birth, and within hours, having just delivered a child in the early morning darkness, she was removed from the house. There is careful language in the newspaper report from the time. The suggestion is that Eliza herself had insisted on leaving, that she had not wanted to stay. What actually happened in those hours, what was said, what pressure was applied, what the Mrs. Cheetham decided, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Eliza was transported from Chilwell to the nearby town of Beeston, while in the immediate aftermath of childbirth without adequate medical care. The inquest jury's verdict, published in the Nottinghamshire Guardian of April 14, 1865, stated plainly that she had died from exhaustion from the cold of that transport and from want of proper medical assistance. She was 28 years old. The baby's fate is not recorded in any of the reports, and the Mrs. Cheetham, by all historical accounts, faced no censure of any kind. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to treat Eliza's case as an extreme outlier, the kind of thing that happened rarely, and was broadly recognised as wrong. But the historical evidence does not support that reading. A study of the intake records at the London Foundling Hospital, the institution that took in the children of unmarried mothers in Victorian London, reveals a striking pattern. In the mid-19th century, 64% of the women who successfully petitioned to have their children admitted were domestic servants. 64%. Not simply working-class women in general, domestic servants specifically. women who had become pregnant while in service or in the immediate aftermath of being dismissed from service, and who had no other way to care for a child they could not provide for and could not acknowledge without destroying whatever remained of their prospects. The founding hospital's admission criteria were strict. The mother had to prove she had been of good character before the pregnancy. She had to demonstrate that she had been in some sense deceived or abandoned by the father. She had to be willing to give up the child completely and permanently, and she had to appear before a board of male governors and convince them that she was deserving of relief. Many were turned away. Many had no access to this option at all, either because they did not know about it, or because they could not navigate the process, or because they were in cities or towns where no such institution existed. For those women, the options were significantly darker. There is a law passed in England in 1834 that I want to explain because it sits at the very centre of this story and is not as well known as it should be. The New Poor Law of 1834 placed the entire financial responsibility for an illegitimate child on the mother, not the father, the mother. Before this law, a woman could take a man to court and seek an affiliation order, a legal requirement that the father contribute to the child's upkeep. After 1834, that avenue was effectively closed. The state had decided clearly and in writing that the consequences of an out-of-wedlock birth were the woman's problem alone. Combined with the no-followers rule, the no marriage in service convention, the impossibility of supporting a child on a housemaid's wage, and the near impossibility of finding new employment without a character reference. What you have is a system that was in every practical sense designed to produce an impossible situation for any servant girl who found herself pregnant. She could not keep her job. She could not easily find another job. She could not support a child without employment. She bore sole legal responsibility for a child she had not created alone, and there was no safety net, no social welfare, no health care, nothing. Now I want to name something here because I think it is important and tends to get glossed over in polite historical accounts. A significant number of servant girls became pregnant not through consensual romantic relationships with followers outside the house, but through the actions of men inside it. Men who were their employers, men who were the sons of the house, men who were the other male servants, men who had considerably more power than they did, and understood perfectly well that the girl in question could not refuse, could not complain, and could not leave without losing everything. The historical record documents this with uncomfortable consistency. Court records, newspaper reports, the intake petitions at the Foundling Hospital where young women described often in careful and indirect language being seduced or persuaded by employers' sons or fellow servants of higher rank. Daisy, one of the petitioners whose intake file has been studied by historians, described being noticed by a young man receiving letters from him, meeting him at a servants' party, and then being, in her own careful word, seduced. The word is doing a lot of work there. It covers a great range of experiences from genuine, if misguided, romantic attachment at one end to something that in any other context we would call a serious harm at the other. And what is striking is that regardless of which end of that range the truth lay in any particular case, the consequences fell in every single case on the woman. The man in almost all documented cases faced no formal consequences at all. The girl faced all of them. Here is what I keep returning to when I think about all of this. The great houses of Victorian England were genuinely beautiful. Many of them still are. You can visit them on a summer afternoon walk through the staterooms, look at the paintings stand in the kitchen wing and try to imagine the noise and heat and smell of it all. And the families who owned these houses were not in most cases monsters. Many of them were generous in certain ways. Many of them genuinely believed they were providing their servants with a good and stable life. but the system they inhabited, the system they benefited from, and did not question, and did not reform for well over a century, that system had real consequences for real people. Eliza Bollins in Nottinghamshire. The 64% of women who filled the Foundling Hospital intake forms. The thousands of girls who were dismissed without a character, without warning, without appeal. The no-followers rule sounds from a modern distance almost quaint, like a strict boarding school policy. But trace its consequences all the way to the end and it is anything but quaint. And yet, and I mean this sincerely, the story does not end there. Because something was changing even within these rigid walls. From the 1880s onward, accounts of domestic service begin to shift in tone. Servants began quietly and individually, and then with increasing confidence to push back. Some left service altogether for factory work or shop work despite the lower wages, because the freedom was worth more than the relative security. Some married in defiance of the rules and simply quit before they could be dismissed on their own terms rather than anyone else's. Some found ways to maintain their followers that the housekeeper never detected, because human ingenuity in the face of unjust rules is remarkably persistent, and some of them told their stories later in interviews, in letters, in the kind of oral histories that have ended up in local archives and university collections, making sure the record reflected what had actually happened in those houses, in those kitchens, in those cold attic rooms at the top of the back stairs. What they were saying in those accounts is something we are going to spend the next part of this story with, because the hidden work of servant girls was not only the work of their hands, it was also quietly and persistently the work of holding on to themselves. Coming up next, what they were actually skilled at, what they knew, and what happened when the skills they spent years developing were never recorded, never credited, never paid for at anything close to their true value. The still room, the laundry, the dairy, the kitchen, the places where the real knowledge of the great house lived, and the women who carried it. Let me take you somewhere quieter for a moment. Away from the cold stone scullery floor, away from the housekeeper's jangling keys, away from the careful politics of the servants' hall seating arrangement. There are rooms in the great house that almost nobody talks about when they tell the history of these places, not because they were unimportant, but because the work that happened inside them was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily life that it became like most things done well by women simply expected. The still room, the laundry, the dairy. These were not glamorous spaces. They had no grand portraits on the walls, no gilded ceilings, no marble floors. But if you wanted to understand what actually kept the great house running, not just clean, but genuinely functioning as the self-contained world it needed to be, these were the rooms where the real knowledge lived. And the women who worked in them carried expertise that the family above stairs could not have replicated, could not have bought from any shop, and would not have known how to begin to acquire. The still room. Even the name is unusual, and I think it is worth pausing on it. The still in still room does not refer to silence, though it was generally a quiet place. It refers to a piece of equipment, the alembic still, a distillation device used to extract oils, essences and medicinal compounds from herbs, flowers and other botanical materials. The earliest recorded still room in an English great house dates to Hengrave Hall in Suffolk in 1603, but the practice went back centuries before that to the monasteries where monks had developed sophisticated traditions of herbal medicine and distillation, and to the medieval manors where the lady of the house was expected to function as the household's doctor, pharmacist and chemist all at once. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in the 1540s and the free medical services they had provided essentially vanished overnight, it was the women of the great houses who stepped into that gap. The still room was where that happened. By the Victorian era, the still room maid had inherited a role that was in the truest sense an encyclopedia of practical knowledge accumulated over centuries. Let me give you a sense of what she actually produced. In the preserve category alone, pickled eggs, pickled vegetables, fermented chutneys, marmalades and jams, candied fruit, dried herbs, spiced sugar fruit preserved in brandy or Madeira, at Calke Abbey in Derbyshire, another of the great English estates whose archives survive with remarkable completeness. The records include cherries in brandy, strawberries in Madeira, piccalilli made with mustard, and turmeric pickled eggs, in quantities large enough to carry the household through the long months of winter when hens naturally stopped laying. In the medicines and remedies category, tinctures distilled from lavender and rosemary ointments, made from beeswax and herbs, syrups for coughs, poultices for inflamed skin tonics, for the servants who fell ill and could not afford a doctor. In the household products category, candles, furniture, polish, soap, perfumed waters, sachets to keep moths from the linens, and in the beverages category, tea preparation and service homebrewed beer wines, cordials, and the afternoon tea service sandwiches, cakes, and the good china, which in many households was entirely managed from the still room. Think about that range for a moment. She was a chemist, a pharmacist, a preservationist, a brewer, a confectioner, and a hospitality manager, all folded into one position. There is a letter in the Calke Abbey archive dated to 1865 that I find genuinely moving. A woman named Hannah Pett had applied for the position of still-room maid at Calke, having previously held the same role in the household of Lord Belper in Derby. She wrote the letter herself. Not a husband, not a father, not a more literate friend. She wrote it, and in it she set out her skills, what she could make, what she had experience with, what she had learned in her previous position. Think about what that means. Here is a woman in the 1860s working in domestic service, an occupation that was built around the systematic erasure of individual identity, who sat down and wrote a letter saying essentially, this is what I know. This is what I can do. This is what I am worth. The letter worked. She got the position. Hannah Pett is recorded in the Calque census of 1871 employed as still-room maid. Her letter is still in the archive. Her skills set out in her own handwriting survived when so much else was lost. But if the still-room was the great house's quiet laboratory, the laundry was something altogether different. Louder, hotter, heavier, and in many ways even more technically demanding than most people realize. The laundry at a great estate was typically in a separate building, or at least a completely separate wing for very practical reasons. The combination of steam heat and the quantities of water involved made it unsuitable for the main house. But there was another reason the laundry existed apart from the rest of the servants' quarters, and it is a detail I find quietly fascinating. The laundry maids had a reputation. Because the laundry building was at the edge of the estate, more accessible from the outside, less visible to the housekeeper's supervision, the women who worked there were considered, in the careful language of Victorian household management, to be of a somewhat independent character. Gardeners and grooms could more easily find their way to the laundry. The housekeeper's eye could not reliably reach there, and so the laundry maids, despite the grinding physical nature of their work, occupied a small zone of relative freedom that most of the indoor servants did not have. Whether the reputation was deserved is impossible to say with any confidence, but it was consistent across multiple household accounts from the period. The laundry girls were considered in whispers to be a little less controllable, which in the world of the great house was about as close to transgressive as most of them ever got. Now let me tell you about the actual work. Because doing laundry in a Victorian great house is not a phrase that means anything like what it sounds like to modern ears. Think about the volume alone. A household with a family of 6 several house guests and a staff of 20 or 25 produced an almost incomprehensible amount of laundry every week. bed linens for every bedroom, and in great houses beds were made with multiple layers of sheets changed regularly. Table linens in a house where a formal dinner service might involve a tablecloth, napkins and runners for 30 guests, all in fine white linen. The family's clothing and aristocratic women in the Victorian era changed outfits multiple times daily, which meant that the laundry maid was dealing with morning dresses, afternoon tea gowns, evening dresses and night clothes for each member of the family, the servants' uniforms, the kitchen cloths, the dusting cloths, the polishing rags, all of it every week. And the process was not simply put it in the machine and press a button. The wash began on Sunday, or rather it began the night before, when the laundry maid sorted every item and set the most heavily soiled pieces to soak overnight in warm water. Monday was what was known as Blue Monday, not because of anyone's mood, though the mood was probably not cheerful, because of the bluing agent indigo-based powder added to the final rinse water to counteract the natural yellowing of white fabric and make it gleam a brighter white. The process began before dawn. The copper, a large iron or tin boiler set over a brick firebox, had to be lit and brought to temperature. Clothes were sorted by fineness, the most delicate muslins and laces washed first in clean water. The heavier cottons and linens boiled vigorously for 20 to 30 minutes. The woolens handled separately because wool washed in water that anything else had touched would lose its colour and its texture. There was a proper sequence to the water use. There was a proper temperature for each fabric type. There was a knowledge of stain removal that reads today like an early chemistry manual. Sour milk for iron rust on white fabric. Chloride of lime for fruit and wine stains. Oxalic acid for ink. Salt dissolved in cold water for blood stains applied immediately and before any heat touched the fabric. If you've ever wondered how Victorian white cotton stayed white against coal smoke and kitchen grease, and the general filth of 19th century life, this is how. It stayed white because someone knew how to make it white, and that someone had learned through years of practice what no pamphlet or manual could entirely convey. Can I ask you something? When you think about the word skill, when you think about what it means to be truly good at something, where does your mind go? Do you think of professional qualifications? Degrees? Years of formal training? I find myself, the longer I spend with this period of history, increasingly struck by how completely we have redefined that word. Because the laundry maid who could properly starch and iron a muslin evening gown, one of those extraordinarily fine, almost transparent fabrics that Victorian fashion loved, was performing an act of genuine technical mastery. Too hot, and the iron scorched the fabric irreparably. Too cool, and the starch sat lumpy and dull. The iron temperature was tested not by any instrument, but by holding it close to the cheek within a few inches, feeling the heat, and making a judgment. She had no thermometer. She had years of practice in her hands, and if she got it wrong, that evening gown might be unwearable. The cost might come from her wages, and the family would never know how close a thing it had been, because when they put it on it was perfect. The dairymaid occupied a slightly different world from the still room and the laundry. On the larger estates, particularly the country houses that were genuinely self-sustaining agricultural operations, rather than purely residential properties, the dairy was a working building that produced the butter and cheese consumed by the whole household. The dairymaid's day began at a time that would make even the scullery maid wince. The cows needed milking before the house stirred, which meant 4 o'clock in the morning, sometimes earlier, walking out to the cowshed in whatever the weather offered. After milking, the milk had to be processed quickly, because without refrigeration it began to turn within hours. Cream was skimmed for butter making. Rennet was added to the remaining milk, and it was warmed carefully to the right temperature for cheese. The butter was worked, churned, pressed, shaped, using techniques that depended entirely on the temperature of the dairy, the temperature of the milk, the season, and the condition of the cream. A dairymaid who could consistently produce good butter in the middle of August when heat threatened to make the whole operation go rancid before it had even begun, was doing something that required both skill and genuine problem-solving under pressure, and dairy work, like stillroom work, like laundry work, had a tradition of knowledge transmission that operated entirely outside any formal educational system. A dairymaid learned from the woman before her, who had learned from the woman before her, who had learned possibly from the woman before her. The knowledge was alive, oral, practical, and deeply personal, and when the woman who carried it left service, it left with her, unless she had passed it on. There is a term used in history and economics that I think applies beautifully here. Tacit knowledge. Knowledge that cannot be fully written down. Knowledge that lives in the hands and the eyes, and the accumulated judgment of someone who has done a thing enough times to know it in their body, not just in their head. The stillroom's herbal distillation, the laundry's starch and iron and bluing, the dairy's butter and cheese, all of it was tacit knowledge. And all of it was held in the Victorian great house by women who were paid £12 to £20 a year, who worked without unions or contracts or formal recognition of any kind, and whose names were recorded, if at all, only in the brief entries of household wage books and decennial census returns. The knowledge they carried was worth far more than what they were paid for it, and the people who benefited from it most were in most cases entirely unaware of its depth. There is one more room I want to take you into before we leave this part of the story. The kitchen. Not the scullery, we have spent time there already. The kitchen itself, because the cook and the kitchen maid who worked directly under her held a form of knowledge that was perhaps the most consequential of all. In a great house that entertained regularly, the kitchen was a production operation of staggering complexity. A formal dinner might run to 7 or 8 courses. A house party weekend might mean catering for 20 or 30 guests at every meal for 4 or 5 days. The cook who managed this was in practical terms a logistics director, a head chef, a menu planner, a budget manager, and a people manager all at once. She knew which game was in season and when it would be past its best. She knew how much advance preparation each dish required. She knew which guests had dietary restrictions, a Victorian term that covered everything from genuine medical needs to the genteel avoidance of anything too rich for a lady's constitution. She knew how to produce a meal that appeared effortless from the dining room while managing in the kitchen below a controlled chaos of simultaneous preparations. And she had learned all of this not from a culinary school, those barely existed, but from working for years in increasingly demanding kitchens, absorbing knowledge through practice and observation, and the occasional sharp word from a more experienced cook above her. I want to end part 7 with something that might stay with you. In the long history of great English houses, the houses that are now museums that attract visitors from around the world, that appear in period dramas and travel documentaries and coffee table books, there is an almost universal tendency to focus on what is visible. The grand rooms, the portraits, the furniture, the silver, the physical evidence of wealth and taste preserved under careful climate control for future generations to admire. And all of that is genuinely worth admiring. But the knowledge that made those houses work, the intricate, accumulated, practically irreplaceable expertise that lived in the still room, and the laundry and the dairy and the kitchen, that knowledge is almost entirely gone. It was never systematically recorded. It was never valued at anything close to its real worth. And when the world that required it changed, when the great houses began to decline, when the women who had carried this knowledge left service and were not replaced, it largely vanished with them. We have the houses, we have the portraits. We do not have in any complete sense the knowledge that made them live, and I find that a very specific kind of loss. Up until now, we've been looking at the great house from the inside, at the rooms, the hierarchies, the rules, the skills, the private costs of a life spent in service. But there is a question we've not yet asked directly. What did the servant girls actually eat? Where did they actually sleep? What was the physical texture of the life they lived inside those grand walls? Because there is a stunning contrast between what the great house was and what the people who ran it were given in return for their labour. And once you see it clearly, once you understand how starkly different the two worlds were, not just in status, but in the most basic material conditions of daily life, everything else we have talked about lands differently. That is where we're going next. The other side of the grand house. Something I want to do right at the start of this part is make you a small promise. By the time we finish tonight, you're going to look at a photograph of a grand English country house completely differently from how you looked at it before. Not because the house will be any less beautiful, but because you will know in a way that you cannot unknow what the distance was between the life happening in the staterooms above and the life happening in the rooms below. And that distance was not just social, it was physical, it was material. It was measured in the temperature of the food on your plate, the number of bodies sleeping in your room, and the precise thickness of the carpet under your feet. Let us start there. The carpet. It is a small thing, but I think it captures everything. In a Victorian great house, the carpeting was not simply a matter of decor. It was a system of status made physical. The finest carpets, thick, patterned, warm underfoot, were in the drawing room, the dining room, the family bedrooms. As the carpets aged and wore through, they migrated. From the drawing room to the master bedroom. From the master bedroom to the children's nursery. From the nursery cut down and trimmed to the governess's room. And from there a piece might eventually reach the servant's room. By that point it would have been in service for 20 years. It would be threadbare. It would be so faded that the original pattern was barely visible. But it was still a carpet. And in the attic rooms where the housemaids slept, even a worn-out remnant of carpet was for a significant portion of the Victorian era considered a reasonable provision. In some houses there was no carpet at all, just bare floorboards. Let me describe one of those attic rooms for you, because the contrast with the rooms the servant girls spent their days maintaining is one of the most quietly devastating details in this whole story. The family's bedrooms were on the first or second floor of the house, spacious, high-ceilinged, each with its own fireplace, its own wardrobe, its own dressing table, furnished with silver-backed brushes and crystal perfume bottles. The beds were four-poster, or at least handsomely framed with multiple layers of fine linen and wool blankets. The windows had thick curtains to keep out draughts. There was hot water brought to the washstand every morning. There was privacy. The attic rooms where the under-housemaids and kitchen maids slept were by almost every surviving account a different world. Small sometimes, no larger than a generous closet. Low-ceilinged because the attic followed the pitch of the roof, in summer roasting. In winter as cold as the outside temperature because the attic was the last place in the house that any heat reached. The furniture was as one Victorian writer described it, the rejects of the downstairs rooms. Whatever chair or chest of drawers had been replaced in the family's rooms and sent upstairs rather than disposed of. The bed-iron frame straw or flock mattress was sometimes shared between two girls, not because the household was particularly poor, but because two girls in one attic room was simply the standard arrangement in many houses, and privacy there was almost none. Everything that happened in that room, the brief minutes of quiet before sleep, the early morning dressing, the rare moments of personal time happened in the company of whoever else slept there. There is a detail in one historical account of servants' quarters in a London town mansion that I find genuinely striking. The account from the early Victorian period describes a household where the footman, the male servant, slept 2, 3 or 4 to a small room in the basement on what were called truckle beds, low folding beds that could be pushed under larger furniture when not in use. These rooms needed artificial light almost continuously because the basement windows were so small and so close to ground level that natural daylight barely penetrated. Imagine that for a moment. You sleep in a room that requires a lamp during the day. You wake at 5 or 6 in the morning to go upstairs and light fires that will warm rooms flooded with morning light. You spend your working hours in the bright, airy parts of the house, and then you return to the dark. Now let us talk about food. Because this is the part that I find myself returning to when I want to understand the texture of servant life at its most concrete. The family's meals were depending on the household, the cook, and the family's social aspirations' impressive productions. Breakfast alone in a well-run Victorian household might include porridge eggs, several varieties of fish, bacon and sausages, cold meats, fresh bread, rolls, preserves, and coffee. A formal dinner service could run to 7 or 8 courses over several hours, soup, fish entrees, a joint of meat game, a sweet, a savoury and dessert. And across all of this, across the courses, the silver, the polished crystal, the carefully pressed tablecloths, there was almost always more food than the family and their guests could eat. Which is where the servant food story gets genuinely interesting, because the leftover system was for the experienced servant one of the genuine consolations of the job. The food that came back from the dining room after a dinner party, the cold chicken that had not been touched, the slice of pheasant that a guest had barely started the ices, and soufflés that could not be stored, all of it made its way downstairs. And in households where this system worked generously, the servant's supper after a grand dinner could be, in the words of one account, a surprisingly excellent meal. Cold venison, pieces of elaborate dessert, scraps of dishes that the servants would never have encountered at home in their villages. One description I came across talked about servants who, having grown up on bread and potatoes, tasted their first pheasant from the remnants of a family dinner. There is something both wonderful and terrible about that image. Wonderful because yes, they ate well sometimes. Terrible because well was defined entirely by what the family had chosen not to finish. The regular diet, however, what the servants ate on the ordinary days that made up the vast majority of their lives, was something considerably plainer. Breakfast in the servants' hall typically meant bread, possibly porridge and tea. The main dinner, taken in the middle of the day, was a plain meat and vegetable meal. Roast mutton, Irish stew, occasionally herring, or other inexpensive fish served with seasonal vegetables from the kitchen garden. Supper in the evening was simpler. Still, cold meat bread, rice pudding, or sweat pudding. There was beer in many households, small beer, low alcohol, but a standard provision. Tea was universal. Everything else depended entirely on the generosity of the housekeeper and the cook. And here is the thing about that dependency. The housekeeper controlled the store cupboards. She controlled the quantities of food allocated to the servants' hall. She controlled who got what when and how much. In a house with a generous housekeeper, the servants ate decently and consistently. In a house with a strict or mean-spirited one, the girls at the bottom of the hierarchy, the tweenie, the scullery maid, the youngest kitchen maid might find, their portions had been cut, their bread slightly stale, their tea made from leaves that had already been used once upstairs. There is a 1919 report from the Advisory Women's Committee on what was then called the domestic service problem, a government inquiry into why young women were increasingly refusing to enter service, that noted with careful understatement that the difference in quality between the food served in the dining room and the food served in the servants' hall was another class distinction, which leads to a spirit of bitterness. A spirit of bitterness. That is a very measured way of saying the women who cooked the family's food at something demonstrably worse. I want to ask you something that I think gets to the heart of this. Have you ever worked very hard at a job, really worked physically for hours, and then been expected to feel grateful for the conditions you worked in? Because that is the emotional logic that ran the below-stairs world. The servants were expected to understand that their food, their room and their keep were part of their compensation, not simply what they were owed in exchange for the work they did, but a form of generosity from the family. They were being housed, they were being fed, they had a position. And when the servants' rooms were damp and cold and the food was plain and monotonous, this framing made it very difficult to articulate a grievance, because to complain was to seem ungrateful, and ungrateful servants did not receive good character references. And without a character reference, as we established in Part 4, there was very little you could do. There was one exception to the general plainness of servant life that I think deserves its own moment. The servants' ball. Once a year, or sometimes once a season, in the most generous households the family would hold a party for the below-stairs staff. The servants' hall would be cleared and decorated. The food on offer was for this one night genuinely festive roast meats, rich sauces, tarts and jellies, and blancmange punch. There was music, there was dancing, and the family in many households actually attended not as equals but as benevolent observers, moving through the hall to speak with their staff, accepting toasts, performing the gracious role of the generous employer. There are accounts that describe these evenings with genuine warmth. The one night when the strict geography of the house dissolved slightly. The one night when the scullery maid could stand in the decorated servants' hall and eat something that bore some resemblance to what went upstairs every evening. The one night when the whole below-stairs world paused, breathed, and remembered that it was made of people. And then Monday morning came and it was 5 o'clock again. There is one more dimension of daily life I want to spend a moment with because it seems small but carries a surprising amount of weight. Sunday. For most servant girls, Sunday was the only day that offered anything resembling personal time. But personal time is perhaps a generous description. In the Victorian era, the expectation was that servants would attend church as a household unit, walking to the local parish together, sitting in the back pews, or the gallery separated from the family by exactly the correct distance. They did not choose which service to attend. They did not choose whether to go. Even employers who were themselves barely observant sent their servants to church, partly out of genuine religious feeling, and partly one suspects because a servant at church was a servant whose whereabouts were known and accounted for. After the morning service, there might be a half-afternoon to oneself, from roughly 2 o'clock until supper time, maybe 4 hours, in which a young woman who had been on her feet since 5 in the morning, 6 days out of 7, could walk into the village, write a letter home, or simply sit somewhere quiet and exist as herself for a few hours before the week began again. Those hours matter to me in a way I find difficult to fully articulate. Think about what they represent. 4 hours a week of genuine selfhood in the middle of a life structured almost entirely around the service of others. 4 hours to be a daughter or a friend or simply a young woman who liked the feel of the afternoon sun and wanted to sit by a river for a little while. For many of the girls in service, those Sunday hours were not just rest. They were the proof that they existed outside the house. They were the evidence that there was a self that the household had not entirely consumed, and the tenacity with which they held on to that small space, the way they found small extensions of it, small freedoms within it, small acts of life within the rigid frame of service is something I find genuinely moving. We have spent a lot of time now inside the walls of the great house, inside the cold and the food and the hierarchy and the rules and the rooms, and I want to begin moving towards something different. Because for all of this, the exhaustion, the constraints, the invisibility, the servant girls were not simply passive. They were not simply enduring. They pushed back, some loudly, some quietly, some in ways that left a record and some in ways that only survive as a whisper between the lines of other documents. Coming up next, we're going to look at the small acts of resistance and the larger ones that ran like a quiet current through the below-stairs world. Because the most powerful thing a person can do when the world is designed to make them invisible is to insist on being seen. And that story is extraordinary. There is a word that started appearing with increasing frequency in the household management literature of the 1880s, and by the Edwardian era it had become something close to a national obsession among the employing classes. The word was problem, as in the servant problem. Column after column in newspapers, articles in women's magazines, letters to editors from frustrated mistresses, pamphlets from household management consultants, all of them circling the same complaint dressed up in various polite phrasings. Servants were harder to find. Servants were less reliable than they used to be. Servants seemed to think they had opinions. Servants were in the precise language of one late Victorian household manual, written for the employing classes, no longer displaying what the author called the proper spirit of deference. I find that phrase absolutely extraordinary. The proper spirit of deference. As if deference were not something that had to be earned or negotiated or maintained through fair treatment, but simply a natural condition that well-ordered servants ought to possess the way the silver possessed its shine. And the fact that this spirit was apparently fading, apparently draining out of the below-stairs world like water through a cracked pot, was considered a social crisis. Not a sign that conditions needed to improve. A social crisis. What was actually happening, if we step back from the alarmed language of the employers and look at it plainly, was something far less mysterious than a crisis. The women who had historically had no choice but to enter domestic service were beginning slowly, unevenly, in certain places faster than others, to have other choices. From the 1880s onward, the expansion of manufacturing and retail created alternatives. A girl who might previously have entered service as her only respectable option could now, in an industrial town, work in a factory or a shop. The pay was not necessarily better. The hours were often just as long, but two things were fundamentally different. When the factory whistle blew at the end of the shift, you went home. You were not on call through the evening, through the night, available for the bell to ring at any hour. You were not living inside your employer's house, subject to their rules about your visitors, your letters, your half-days, your appearance, your private life. You had, in the bluntest terms, somewhere to go, and Sundays were your own. That freedom, the simple, unspectacular freedom of leaving work at the end of the day and going somewhere that was not your employer's property, turned out to be worth a great deal. By 1857, 2/3 of working women in England were employed as domestic servants. By 1901, that had declined to 50%. By 1945, just 18%. The numbers tell the story without any further embellishment. Women left when they could, but I want to focus on something that tends to get lost in the larger historical narrative of service's decline. Because the story of resistance was not only the story of women leaving for factories, it was also the story of what happened inside the houses day after day across the decades before the large-scale departure. And that story is in a quieter way just as remarkable. Let me introduce you to Margaret Powell. Margaret was born in 1907 in Hove, a seaside town on the southern coast of England, the second child in a family of 7. Her childhood was marked by a poverty that was ordinary and pervasive, not quite starvation, but a persistent awareness that other families had more than hers did. She was clever. She won a scholarship to a better school, but the scholarship could not pay for food, and at 13 she left education behind and went to work. At 15 she entered service as a kitchen maid in one of the great houses of London. What happened over the following years, and what she eventually wrote about in her memoir published in 1968 under the title Below Stairs, is one of the most vividly honest accounts of the below-stairs world that has ever been set down. And what makes Margaret's story different from a simple chronicle of hardship is her voice. She was angry, not in a self-pitying way, in a clear-eyed, frequently funny, completely undeceived way. She saw the house around her exactly as it was. She saw the people above stairs exactly as they were, and she refused at the most fundamental level to pretend otherwise. Margaret described arriving at her first position with a mix of nerves and curiosity, and finding quickly that the reality of life as a kitchen maid was, as she put it in her own words, not quite what the advertisements had implied. The work was relentless. The conditions were exactly as we have described across this story. But what Margaret did, and this is the thing that makes her account so valuable, is resist the framing. The framing that told her she should feel grateful. The framing that told her the family was doing her a kindness by employing her. The framing that told her a decent girl would not complain about ironing the master's bootlaces or blacking the kitchen range at 5:30 in the morning. She did not accept that framing. She did not believe in her bones that this was the natural order of things, and that refusal, quiet, internal, not yet political, was itself a form of resistance. Margaret changed jobs regularly, not recklessly, not carelessly. But deliberately, whenever a position became intolerable, she used her growing skill and her improving references to move to a better household. She understood very clearly that in a world where servants were the ones who were supposed to defer and adapt, choosing to leave was one of the few genuine acts of agency available to her. "I keep in contact with the girls from my last position," she wrote later, describing how she maintained a network of former colleagues who shared information about which households were well run and which were to be avoided. This network was not formal. It had no name, no rules, no structure, but it was real, and it functioned in practical terms as something that the employing classes understood very well and found thoroughly inconvenient, because employers who treated their servants badly got talked about, and girls with options steered around them. That informal network, that quiet flow of information between servants across households, through letters and Sunday afternoon conversations and whispered exchanges at church, is one of the most underappreciated features of the below-stairs world. Here is something I want to ask you. Have you ever had a job where you knew through a network of colleagues which managers were fair and which were not, which departments were worth applying for and which were traps, which companies paid on time and treated people decently, and which ones promised much and delivered nothing? Of course you have. Every working person does this. It is the informal intelligence that makes a labour market function as something other than pure exploitation, and the servant girls of Victorian and Edwardian England were doing exactly the same thing inside a much harsher set of constraints. They were sharing information. They were warning each other. They were collectively creating a kind of accountability for employers that no formal legal mechanism provided. It was not trade unionism. Trade union organisation was, as one historian noted in a scholarly journal from 1974, considered unthinkable for servants in the legal and social framework of the time. But it was its own form of collective intelligence, and it worked. The job hopping itself, which employers decried as unreliability and lack of loyalty, was from the servant's perspective something more intentional than it looked. Margaret Powell described the calculation involved with characteristic frankness. You timed your departure carefully. You gave enough notice to get a decent character reference. You did not leave so abruptly that the cook or the housekeeper or whoever controlled your reference could legitimately complain. And then you moved to a household where the wages were slightly higher, or the housekeeper was known to be fair, or the attic rooms had a fireplace, or the mistress was the kind of woman who gave a civil good morning to the kitchen maid. These were not grand aspirations. They were small and specific and completely human, And the fact that employers found them maddening suggests more clearly than any labour history text could just how much of the system's functioning had depended on the servants having nowhere else to go. But I want to be careful here not to present resistance as something that was always available, always chosen, always triumphant. Because for every Margaret Powell who navigated the world of service with wit and strategic intelligence, and eventually got out there, were many more women who could not. Women in rural areas far from factories and shops for whom service remained the only viable option for decades. Women who were isolated by geography, or by the particular vulnerability of their family's poverty, or by the way certain employers specifically sought out the most dependent girls, the ones least likely to have local family who might offer an alternative. One employment agent described in a late Victorian household management source was quite candid about the preference for country girls over London girls, specifically because country girls were, in the agent's words, more docile, more tractable, less likely to know their options, less likely to push back. The resistance that was possible for some women was not possible for all. And that truth needs to sit alongside the inspiring story of the women who found ways to push, because the inspiring story is not the whole story. There were also in this period women who took their resistance somewhere else entirely, beyond the household, into the world. From the 1880s onward, as the suffrage movement gathered force in Britain, women from every class began asking a question that the ruling system was not prepared to answer. And some of the women who asked it most loudly were women who had spent years invisible in great houses, women who had watched from behind the wall panelling and through the barely opened service door the confident daily life of people who believed they were born to rule, women who had carried coal to warm the rooms of men who decided the laws, women who had pressed the shirts of members of Parliament who voted against women's right to vote. Women who had, in other words, every possible reason to find the existing political order personally and specifically offensive. Not all servant women became suffragettes. Not all of them had the time, the access, or the safety to participate in public political action. But the movement for women's suffrage drew support from across the class structure, and the experience of domestic service, the experience of being considered useful but not fully human, present but not visible, essential but not valued, had given many women a very precise vocabulary for describing what political exclusion felt like in the body. And then in 1914 the world changed. When the First World War began, it took from the great houses something that no amount of household management guidance could replace. It took the people, young men left for the front, young women who had been told for generations that service was the respectable, stable, correct occupation for their class, discovered that the munitions factories needed workers, that the hospitals needed nurses' aides, that the land needed women to tend it while the men were gone. And the wages in those positions were in some cases more than twice what a housemaid could earn in a year. More than that, those positions came without a housekeeper's key turning in the corridor lock, without the no-followers rule, without the obligation to press yourself against the wall when the family walked by. The great houses began to empty, not all at once, not without resistance from the employing classes who wrote letters and articles and parliamentary papers about the servant problem with increasing desperation. But the emptying had begun, and most of the women who left did not come back. I want to close this part with something that feels to me like the essential truth of everything we've been discussing. Resistance does not always look like revolution. Sometimes it looks like Margaret Powell keeping contact with the under-housemaid from her last position so they could share information about where it was safe to work. Sometimes it looks like a laundry maid taking slightly longer than necessary over a difficult stain because no one was timing her, and the extra 20 minutes were hers. Sometimes it looks like a girl who'd been renamed Mary by 3 successive households insisting in letters home on signing her own name. Sometimes it looks like simply surviving getting through the years, getting out when you could telling someone the truth about what it was like when you finally had the chance. And the fact that Margaret Powell's Below Stairs became a bestseller when it was published in 1968, the fact that Julian Fellowes, creator of Downton Abbey, credited it as a direct inspiration, the fact that it inspired Jean Marsh to create the television series Upstairs. Downstairs tells you something important. The story had been waiting for decades for someone to tell it plainly without apology, with wit and anger and full humanity intact. And when it finally arrived, people recognized it immediately, because it had been true all along. We're getting close to the end of this story now. We have walked through the morning darkness and the cold scullery and the attic rooms. We have sat with the names that were taken and the rules that controlled private life and the skills that went unrecorded. We have watched the resistance build slowly and unevenly across decades, and soon we're going to look at what happened when the world the great houses represented finally came apart. But before we get there, there is one corner of this story we have not yet entered. The last great houses. The ones that are still standing. The ones you can visit on a summer afternoon, walking through staterooms that have been preserved almost exactly as they were. And the question of what we owe to the people who made them live and what it means to remember or to forget. That is where we are heading next. Something happened to England between 1914 and 1950 that has no precise parallel in any other country's history. The great house, that institution which had structured rural life, employed tens of thousands of people, and defined the English landscape for 300 years, began to die. Not slowly, not peacefully, but in a cascade of departures and demolitions and dispersal sales that historians would later call simply the country house crisis, and that others would call something closer to a reckoning. I want to walk you through how it happened, because understanding the death of the great house is not separate from understanding the lives of the servant girls who kept it running. It is in a real sense the final chapter of their story too. The machinery of destruction had actually been set in motion years before the First World War. Agricultural depression from the 1870s had gradually eroded the rental income that most large estates depended on. Then, in 1894, the government introduced a new tax on inherited wealth, officially called estate duty, but popularly known as death duties. At first, this stood at 8% on estates worth more than £1 million. By 1919, peace brought its own demands on the Treasury, and death duties climbed to 40% on estates worth more than £2 million. By 1940, the rate had reached 65%. Think about what that meant in practice. An estate that passed from father to son twice in a generation, as happened frequently in the years surrounding the First World War, when young heirs were killed and their fathers and brothers followed them in rapid succession, could have 65% of its total value removed twice. Not 65% of the income, 65% of everything. The land, the house, the contents, the mathematics of that left no room for survival. And then there was the war itself. The First World War killed across all sides somewhere in the range of 20 million people. Among them, with particular concentration, were the young men of the officer class, the younger sons of the great houses, the heirs, and the spares, the boys who had grown up in those grand rooms and expected to inherit them. Some families lost multiple sons in the space of weeks. Panshanger House in Hertfordshire, a great estate in the county north of London, passed to a Lady Desborough in 1905. Her eldest son Julian was killed in action in 1915. Her second son Gerald was killed 2 months later. A third son survived the war but died in a road accident in 1926. Lady Desborough never recovered. After her death in 1952, the estate was auctioned in lots. The house was demolished in 1954. Panchanga had stood for over a century. It was gone in an afternoon. Between 1919 and 1921, just 2 years after the war ended, roughly a quarter of all the land in England and Wales changed hands. A quarter in 2 years. That figure is almost impossible to absorb. It represented the largest shift of land ownership in England since Henry VIII had dissolved the monasteries in the 1540s, and it was driven by the same inexorable combination of debt and death and tax. Many of the great houses did not transfer to new owners. They simply disappeared. By 1955, historians who had begun tracking the losses estimated that one country house was being demolished every 5 days in England. Every 5 days. Some were reduced quietly families moving into auxiliary buildings, while the main house was pulled down for materials. Some were converted into schools or hospitals, their grand rooms partitioned and their staircases carpeted over. Some simply stood empty for years and then collapsed. Since 1900, at least 1,200 country houses have been demolished in England. The figure may be as high as 1,700 when all the smaller estates are fully counted. In Scotland, proportionally even more were lost. Now I want to pause here for a moment, because I think we should acknowledge something about this wave of destruction. It is easy and understandable to mourn it. These were genuinely beautiful buildings. Many of them were irreplaceable architectural achievements containing irreplaceable collections of art furniture and historical objects. The loss was real, and I do not want to minimize it. But there is another way to read the same event. The great house had been built on a particular understanding of how society was organized, of who had rights and who had responsibilities, and who existed to serve and who was served. That understanding had for 3 centuries produced extraordinary beauty and profound injustice simultaneously. The death duties, the loss of heirs, the departure of the servants for factories and farms, and the war effort, these forces were not designed to destroy the great houses, but they dismantled the conditions that had made those houses possible. The labour that had always been hidden below stairs was simply no longer available, and without the Elizas and the Mauds and the Hannah Cutts carrying the coal and heating the water and lighting the fires and sweeping the rooms before anyone else woke up. A house with 40 rooms was not a house anymore. It was a maintenance problem. Let me tell you about one house that did not fall. Not because it was wealthy, not because it had powerful connections or a savvy owner, but because the people who owned it had done something no other family in England had ever done in quite the same way. They had remembered their servants. Erdig, pronounced for those of you wondering something like Earthig. Erdig sits on a dramatic escarpment above the winding river Clywydog in North Wales, about 2 miles south of the town of Wrexham. It was built in 1683, 7 years before the reign of William and Mary, for a High Sheriff of Denbighshire named Joshua Edisbury, whose ambitions in building it promptly bankrupted him. The house passed through several owners before settling in 1733 into the hands of a family called the Yorks, and there it stayed remarkably for the next 240 years. What makes Erdig singular in the history of the English great house is not its architecture, though that is fine. It is not its garden, though that is extraordinary. It is not its state rooms, though they contain some of the most important 18th century furniture surviving in Britain. What makes Erdig singular is a wall in the servants' hall and the corridor leading to it, lined with portraits, and beneath each portrait a poem. The tradition was started in 1791 by Philip York I, who commissioned a set of 6 painted portraits of the household servants from a local artist. Not the family, the servants. Jane Abrell, the housemaid, and Spiderbrusher, a real job title referring to the person responsible for clearing cobwebs from the upper corners of rooms, was among the first to be portrayed. She was 87 years old at the time of her portrait. 87. She'd been in service at Erdig for most of her life, and she was painted. Her face, her expression, her presence recorded in oils framed and hung with her name and her role written below. The tradition continued for nearly 200 years. Portraits were commissioned. Then, as photography became available, photographs replaced paintings, but the poems continued. Coachmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, kitchen maids, housemaids, gardeners, each with a portrait, each with a verse. The verses were written by the York family themselves, and they vary in quality. Some are genuinely touching, some are formal, some are awkward in the way that well-meaning amateur poetry sometimes is, but the impulse behind them was something that no other family in England seems to have sustained in the same systematic generation-spanning way. The impulse to say these people were here. Their names were not interchangeable, their faces were not invisible. They mattered, and we're going to put them on the wall. The National Trust, which took ownership of Erdig in 1973 after the last York heir handed over a house that had been sinking into coal mining subsidence and was by then largely without mains, electricity made an extraordinary decision. They would begin the tour of the house not in the state rooms, but below stairs. Every visitor to Erdig today enters through the servants' areas, the kitchen, the laundry, the sawmill, the smithy. They see the preserved workrooms before they see the drawing room. They read the servant portraits on the wall before they see the family's portraits upstairs. It is, if you think about it, a quiet revolutionary act in the way heritage is presented. The people who did the work are shown first. I want to ask you something. Have you ever visited a historic house, maybe Versailles, or one of the great English estates, or a colonial mansion in Virginia, or a plantation house somewhere in the American South, and found yourself thinking about who actually cleaned that place, who polished those floors, who washed those curtains, who carried the food from the kitchen to the table? I think most of us at some level ask these questions when we walk through these beautiful places. We sense the invisible labour embedded in the building, but our eyes are guided very consistently toward the family. The portraits on the walls are the portraits of the people who owned the house. The stories printed in the guidebooks are the stories of the people who had the wealth to commission the building and fill it with art. The servants, their quarters, their names, their stories are almost always, even today, the afterthought, the footnote, the section at the end of the guidebook marked Life Below Stairs. Erdig inverts that, and nothing else quite like it exists anywhere in the world. The 1974 exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, titled simply The Destruction of the Country House, was a watershed moment in how the British public understood what had been lost. The exhibition documented for the first time in a comprehensive and emotionally devastating way the scale of the demolitions. Photographs of houses before and after, architectural drawings of buildings that no longer existed, records of contents dispersed at auction paintings that had been in the same room for 200 years now scattered across dealers' rooms and foreign collections. It caused something close to national shock, and it helped catalyse a movement that eventually saved many of the houses that had not yet been lost through National Trust acquisition, through preservation legislation, through a genuine change in public feeling about what these buildings represented. By 1992, 600 stately homes were being visited annually by 50 million members of the paying public. The great houses, or what remained of them, had become a form of national memory. But here is the question I keep returning to. Whose national memory? When those 50 million visitors walk through the staterooms of Chatsworth and Blenheim and Longleat, when they admired the portraits and the furniture and the perfectly maintained gardens, what story were they being told? The family story in the main. The story of the people who had owned the building and filled it with beautiful things. The story of the lord who'd been at court and the lady who had redecorated the drawing room in 1790, and the son who had fought at Waterloo and come home to hang his portrait on the landing. Those are real stories. They deserve to be told. But the other story, the story of the girl who came through the servants' entrance at 13 years old, with a small wooden box containing everything she owned, who spent years making those rooms beautiful and invisible, at the same time who might have been renamed Mary or Jane or Eliza, and whose own name appears, if it appears at all, in a wage book entry with no dates, and no context, and no portrait on the wall. That story is told in very few places. Erdig is one of them. Margaret Powell's Below Stairs is one of them. Hannah Culwick's diaries preserved at Trinity College are one of them. The oral histories in local archives across England and Scotland and Ireland are scattered pieces of it. This video, I hope, is part of it too. We are nearing the end of this story, but we are not quite there yet. Because I want to spend the final parts of tonight with something that feels to me like the most important question this whole series has been building toward. Not just what happened to these women, not just what they endured, but what their lives mean for how we understand ourselves now, what the hidden work of servant girls tells us about value and visibility, and the kind of labour that sustains every society in every era, and that is still in many places and in many forms the least acknowledged and the least rewarded. Because the servant girl may be gone from the great house, but the hidden work she did that never really went away, it just changed shape, and the next part of this story is about that shape. At some point during this series you may have found yourself asking a question that I think is worth naming directly. Why does this matter now, not in a dismissive way, in the genuine way? What does a story about Victorian servant girls, their cold attic rooms and their interchangeable names and their 5 o'clock mornings and their china-thin fragility within a system that was not designed to protect them? What does any of that have to do with the world you're living in right now? I want to try to answer that, not with a lecture, but with a few numbers, and then with something that I think will stay with you. Right now, today, there are approximately 76 million domestic workers in the world. 76 million. More than the entire population of France. Roughly 80% of them are women. Of those, an estimated 67 million are adults working directly in private households, cleaning, cooking, caring for children, caring for elderly people, maintaining the homes of people who are themselves out working in the formal economy. Around 42% of those workers globally lack access to minimum wage protections, not because they are paid below minimum wage while technically covered by it, but because in the country where they work, domestic workers are explicitly excluded from minimum wage legislation entirely. In some countries, a private household is still not legally recognised as a workplace, which means the people who work in it are not legally recognised as workers. In 2011, that is just 15 years ago, the International Labour Organization adopted what it called Convention Number 189, the first international treaty ever to establish basic labour standards specifically for domestic workers. The right to a weekly rest day, the right to minimum wage, the right to clear employment terms, the right to live somewhere other than the employer's home if they chose. These were considered in 2011 sufficiently radical that the convention was met with abstentions and opposition from several wealthy nations. Basic rights, weekly rest, minimum wage, radical in 2011. Do you see what I am pointing at? The distance between the world of the Victorian servant girl and the world of today is not as large as we tend to assume. The work has not changed. The conditions of the work have not changed in the ways that would matter most. What has changed is the geography. In Victorian England, the servant girl came from the rural counties from Somerset or Yorkshire, or the western reaches of Ireland to the great houses and the town mansions of the wealthy. Today she is more likely to come from the Philippines or Indonesia or Sri Lanka or Ethiopia or Guatemala. She comes to Singapore or Dubai or London or Los Angeles or Hong Kong. She is still in most cases a young woman from a less wealthy place, working in the home of a wealthier family, sending a significant portion of her earnings home to support her own children, her own parents, her own community. She still in many cases lives inside the employer's home. She still in many cases has restricted freedom of movement. She still in many cases has her passport held by her employer. She's still, in the language of the International Labour Organization, invisible. That word again, invisible. The word we have been following through this story for 10 parts. I want to be careful here because I think it is important not to collapse the past and present into a single, undifferentiated story. There are genuine differences. The Victorian servant girl operated within a legal framework that gave her almost no recourse, but she was at least operating within the same country as her employer, speaking the same language, having access in principle to the same courts. Many modern domestic workers are migrants with uncertain legal status in a country whose language they may not fully speak, whose laws they may not understand, and whose courts they may have no practical ability to access. In some respects, the vulnerability is deeper, and in other respects, there are tools available now that did not exist then. Trade union organizing for domestic workers, international advocacy organizations, the kind of public awareness that was simply not possible before global media. The progress is real. It is just much slower than it should be given how much of the argument for change has been available for over a century. There is something I have been thinking about throughout this series that I want to try to articulate. It is about a gap. The gap between essential and valued. Throughout this story we have returned again and again to the paradox at the heart of the great house. The work that kept it running was by any rational assessment essential. Without the fires lit at 5 in the morning, the house was cold. Without the water heated and carried, the family could not wash. Without the rooms cleaned and the silver polished and the food prepared, the whole elegant production fell apart. The great house was beautiful because of the servant girls. This was not subtle, it was not disputed. It was openly acknowledged by the people who wrote the household management books, who listed the duties, who calculated the wages. And yet those same people almost universally paid those workers as little as possible, housed them in the worst rooms, gave them the least food, controlled their private lives with breathtaking thoroughness, and designed the physical architecture of the building to make sure they remained invisible to the people whose lives they were sustaining. Essential, not valued. Those two things existed simultaneously, without contradiction, without apparent cognitive dissonance. When the global pandemic arrived in 2020, it exposed this same gap in a way that was briefly impossible to ignore. For a few months in cities around the world, people leaned out of their windows and banged pots and pans to honour the healthcare workers who were keeping the hospitals running. There was a genuine outpouring of recognition. And then almost immediately the conversation turned to which of those workers would receive the pay rise that such recognition might imply. In most places the answer was very few. In some places the answer was none. The cleaners who were sanitizing the hospital wards, the care workers who were keeping elderly people alive in care homes, the domestic workers who were managing the households of families working from home, now cooking 3 meals a day, and cleaning continuously while the professional household members joined video calls. They were described as heroes. They did not receive hero pay, or hero conditions, or hero recognition in any form that lasted beyond the initial emergency. Because it turned out as it had turned out in the Victorian Great House, as it has turned out in every iteration of this story, that being essential was not the same as being valued, and it has never been. Now I want to hold something alongside all of that, because I do not want this part of the story to be purely bleak. There is something that runs through all of this that I find in a strange and unexpected way, genuinely moving, and it is this: the work itself, not the conditions, not the wages, not the visibility or lack thereof, the work itself. When Maud stood in her cold scullery and came to feel over time that it was her space, when Hannah Culwick wrote in her secret diary about the satisfaction of a job well done, when Hannah Pett from Colcare wrote her own letter of application in her own hand, setting out her skills, when Margaret Powell described with characteristic frankness and occasional hilarity the specific challenges and occasional pleasures of being genuinely good at a difficult job, what runs through all of it is something I think we often underestimate: the pride of competence, the dignity of work well done, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that a room is clean because your hands cleaned it, that a meal was good because your knowledge made it good, that a house is beautiful, partly because you cared for it. These things matter. They matter now just as they mattered then. And one of the things I find most striking about the stories of servant women who left accounts of their lives, the memoirs, the oral histories, the diaries, is how often alongside the exhaustion and the resentment and the legitimate anger, there is also this other note, a kind of ownership. Not legal ownership, the deeper kind. The ownership that comes from knowing a thing intimately because you have worked it with your hands. Let me tell you about a woman named Josephine. Josephine is not a Victorian servant. She's a domestic worker from the Philippines who came to work in a household in Hong Kong in the 1990s. Her story was collected as part of a research project on migrant domestic workers in East Asia. She describes arriving in a new city in a new country, knowing almost no one, working in a household where she was the only employee. She describes the loneliness of the first months, which will sound familiar to anyone who's been following this series. She describes the restrictions on her movement outside the house, the way her employer monitored her phone calls, the particular kind of isolation that comes from living in someone else's home while not being part of their family. And she describes also the slow process of making herself at home in the work, learning the quirks of the kitchen, understanding what the children needed before they asked for it, finding the rhythm of the household and moving within it with confidence. She says something in the interview that has stayed with me. She says, "I know this house better than the family knows it. I know where everything is, I know what needs doing before it becomes a problem, I know how to keep it running. And that knowledge is mine. No matter what happens, they can't take that from me. That knowledge is mine." From Jane Ebrell, spider brusher at Erdig in 1791, who was painted and commemorated after a lifetime of service, to Josephine in Hong Kong in the 1990s, who is named in a research paper that most people will never read. What runs between them across 2 centuries is the same thing: the refusal to be entirely erased by the work, the insistence that the skill, the knowledge, the intimate understanding of the space, all of it belongs to the person who did the labour, not to the house, not to the family, to her. Something I want to ask you, and I ask it genuinely, not rhetorically. Is there someone in your life right now whose work makes your daily comfort possible, and whose name you do not know, the person who cleans your office building, the person who delivers your groceries, the person who works the night shift in the care home where someone you love is living? I am not asking you to feel guilty. I am asking you to think about the gap between essential and valued, between present and visible, between the work that keeps the world running and the recognition that work receives. Because that gap did not close when the Victorian Great House system ended, it just changed shape. And the shape it takes now is in some ways harder to see than the shape it took then. At least in the Victorian servants' world, the architecture of the house was designed to make the labour invisible. The back stairs and the service corridors told you physically that this labour existed but should not be noticed. In the modern world, the invisibility is more thorough. We have simply decided at a cultural level that this category of work is not quite work in the fullest sense, not quite skilled, not quite complex, not quite worthy of the full apparatus of labour rights and social recognition that we have built for other forms of labour, and every time we pay a domestic worker below minimum wage or refuse to give a care worker a sick day, or dismiss the expertise of someone who has spent years becoming excellent at maintaining the space where our lives happen, we are making the same choice that the Victorian Great House made, just without the architecture to make the logic visible. We are one part away from the end of this story, and the end, I think, is the most important part, because we have spent 11 parts looking at what was hidden, and what was visible, what was remembered, and what was forgotten, what was valued, and what was not. And I want to close with something that feels to me like the real lesson. Not a lesson about history, a lesson about now, about what it means to see people who do the work that makes beauty possible, about what we owe to the hidden labour in every age, and about what it might feel like on any given morning to simply notice who is already awake. We started this story in the dark, 5 o'clock in the morning, a house that has not yet woken up, a girl already on her knees before a cold fireplace coaxing a fire back to life so that the people upstairs would wake up warm. I want to go back to that moment now, not because we've not already spent a great deal of time there, but because I think we are ready to see it differently. When we started, what I asked you to notice was the work, the physical labour of it, the invisibility required, the precise engineering of a household morning designed so completely around the family's comfort that every trace of its own mechanism was hidden before anyone opened their eyes. I asked you to marvel at it in a way, the sheer scale and precision of it, and I hope you did. But what I want to ask you to notice now here at the end of this journey is not the work. It is the girl, specifically, concretely, not as a type, not as a category, as a person who was at 5 o'clock on a cold morning in the English countryside thinking something, feeling something. We do not know exactly what. Maybe she was thinking about her mother's face. Maybe she was thinking about the particular chill in the floorboards under her feet and wishing someone had put down a proper rug. Maybe she was thinking about a boy she'd seen at church on Sunday and was doing her very best not to think about, because thinking about him was a luxury she could not afford. Maybe she was not thinking about anything except getting the fire lit before the cook came downstairs. We do not know. We will never know. Because the system she worked inside was designed at every level to prevent that interiority from being recorded. Her function was recorded. Her wages were recorded. Her name sometimes was recorded, though not always her own name, but what she was thinking, what she wanted, what she feared or hoped for or quietly loved about her own life, that was not considered relevant information, and so it was not kept. We've met a remarkable number of people in this series. I want to spend a few minutes with them one last time, because I think they deserve to be named. Rose Burden, who started as a scullery maid in 1867 and was promoted to kitchen maid by 1871 after 4 years of work in the coldest, dampest room in a great London house. We know only the dates. We know the promotion happened. What we do not know is how she felt on the day she was told, whether she cried, whether she went somewhere quiet and let herself feel it, whether there was someone to share it with, whether it felt like the victory it was, or whether by that point 4 years of a scullery had trained her to expect very little, and therefore receive everything with a kind of careful, guarded gratitude that was not quite joy. We do not know, but she was real, and she mattered. Maud in Shropshire, who cried every night for her first week and eventually found in her cold forgotten scullery a sanctuary no one else wanted, who kept a pot of rosemary on the windowsill because she liked the smell, who discovered 2 years in that the most forgotten room in the house was also the one room that was fully hers. I think about Maud sometimes in the context of something much larger, the human capacity to find dignity in the corners the world has discarded, to insist on beauty in a place that was designed for nothing but function. That pot of rosemary. It was not nothing. It was an act of self-possession so small that no one would have noticed it, and so complete that it changed the nature of the room. Hannah Pett, who wrote her own letter of application to Calkie Abbey in 1865 in her own handwriting, setting out her skills and her experience and her worth. In a world that was not designed to care about any of those things, she made the argument anyway. She wrote it down. She put her name to it. She sent it. And it worked. And her letter still exists in the Calkie Abbey archive. 200 years after she wrote it, you can look at her handwriting. You can read what she believed she knew and what she believed she was worth. Hannah Pett is not invisible, not to anyone who knows where to look. Hannah Culwick, who kept her diaries by candlelight late at night after 17-hour days of labour, and who wrote about her life with a clarity and wit and anger that the world was not ready to receive while she was alive. Her diaries are now at Trinity College in Cambridge. Scholars have studied them. Articles have been written about them. Her voice, which she maintained in secret across decades of a life designed to silence it, has outlasted the houses she cleaned and the families she served. Eliza Bollins, who died in April of 1865 in circumstances that should never have happened, whose story was briefly in the newspaper, and then forgotten, whose baby's fate we do not know. I include Eliza here not to end with grief, but because one of the things we owe the people in this story is not to look away from the parts that are hard, not to smooth them over with the comforting narrative that things were difficult but ultimately fine. Eliza's story tells us what the system cost when it went wrong, and it went wrong often. Her name in a newspaper, a jury's verdict, no portraits, no poem on the wall, just the record of a harm that should not have occurred. We should know her name, Jane Abrell Spiderbrusher, aged 87, who appears in the first portrait commissioned by the York family at Erdig in 1791, 87 years old, a lifetime of service, a face in oils, a poem below her name. I do not know if Jane Abrell would have considered herself lucky in the way we might use that word today. I suspect her experience of her own life was more complicated than luck, but she was seen, in a tradition that almost no other family in England maintained. She was seen, and she was named, and her face was painted, and it hangs on a wall in Wales 230 years later. And when you visit Erdig, you see her before you see anyone else. She's the first person you encounter in that house, as it should be. Margaret Powell, born in 1907 in Hove, kitchen maid at 15, cook by her early 20s, wife of a milkman, mother of 3 sons, author of a memoir that, when it was finally published in 1968, became a bestseller and sparked the creation of the television series that influenced the creator of Downton Abbey. Margaret did not merely survive the world she'd been born into, she named it. She described it with unsparing accuracy and her own particular humour and a complete absence of false sentiment. She understood that the world had not been designed to care about her story, and she told it anyway, in her own words, in her own voice, as exactly herself. I want to say something now that might seem obvious, but that I think is worth saying plainly. The reason we tell stories like this one, stories about people who are meant to be invisible, who lived and worked inside institutions designed to erase them, is not primarily historical. It is not, because the Victorian era is interesting in itself, though it is. It is not because servants' halls and sculleries and still rooms make good period drama, though they do. It is because the question at the centre of this story is a question that is still alive. and it is a very simple question. What does it mean to do the work that makes other people's lives beautiful? What do we owe to the people whose labour sustains us, whose skill we rely on, whose presence we depend on, and whose names we frequently do not know? I think about this question in a way that has changed since I started working on this series. I think about it when I am in a hotel room and the bed is made. I think about it when I walk into a public bathroom that someone has just cleaned. I think about it when the groceries are on my doorstep and I have not spoken to the person who brought them. I think about it when I am in a hospital corridor and a cleaner moves past me with a mop and I have to decide whether to meet their eyes or look away. And the question is not only should I say thank you, the question is larger. The question is, do I actually see them, not look at them, see them as people who are thinking something, feeling something, who have a life that extends beyond the function they are performing for me in this moment, who have names that are their own, who have knowledge and skill that they have spent years acquiring, who have somewhere behind them a story at least as complicated and interesting as mine. The hidden work of servant girls in great houses was hidden not because it was unimportant. It was hidden because it was too important. Because a house built on the myth of its own effortlessness could not afford to acknowledge the labour that made the effortlessness possible. The fires had to appear to have lit themselves. The silver had to appear to have polished itself. The water had to appear to have arrived in the bedroom at exactly the right temperature by some magical domestic process that had nothing to do with a girl who'd been awake since 5. The beauty had to be seamless, and seamless beauty requires invisible labour. This is as true now as it was in 1890. The difference is that now we have the choice to see it. The architecture of the great house was designed to prevent you from noticing. Modern life has no such architecture. The people doing the hidden work are visible if we choose to look. The choice is ours. We've walked through a great deal of history together over the course of this series. We've been in the scullery at 5 in the morning and in the still room with the herbal distillation, and in the attic bedroom that was too cold in winter and too hot in summer. We have sat with the names that were taken away and the rules that controlled private lives, and the small fierce acts of resistance that ran beneath the surface of every household. We have watched the great houses rise to their extraordinary height, and then in the course of a single century fall away. We have listened to Hannah Culwick writing in the dark. We have read Hannah Pett's letter in her own handwriting. We have heard Margaret Powell's voice on the page funny and furious and entirely completely herself. And we have followed the story forward past the country house crisis, past the demolitions, past the 1968 publication of Below Stairs, all the way to the 76 million domestic workers in the world today, whose situation carries more of the Victorian echo than most of us are comfortable acknowledging. That is the story. All of it. The beauty and the injustice and the skill and the erasure and the resistance and the things that were lost and the things that somehow survived. And now I want to ask you something personal. Is there someone in your life living or no longer living whose hidden work shaped yours? A grandmother who kept a household running with a precision and skill that was never called expertise. A parent who worked a job that put food on the table and was never given a title that reflected what it actually required. A person you have relied on and perhaps still rely on whose contribution to the conditions of your life you have not fully looked at. Maybe now is the moment, not to feel guilty about it, but to look, to actually see it, to say even to yourself, even quietly, I know what this cost, I know what this was worth, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The last thing I want to leave you with tonight is something small, something that given everything we have talked about might feel almost too small, but it has stayed with me. There is a record in the Erdig archive in among all those portraits and poems and wage books of a housekeeper named Harriet Rogers, who drew up a list of prices for the servants' laundry, a practical document, a list of what it would cost to wash a shirt or a pair of stockings or a cap. Completely ordinary. The kind of document that survives by accident because someone filed it in a drawer and forgot about it and then never threw it out. Harriet Rogers, a price list. 200 years later in the archive at Erdig, researchers can hold that piece of paper and read her handwriting. They know something she never imagined they would know. They know the price she put on clean things, the value she assigned to the labour of keeping a household in order, numbers in her hand, evidence that she thought carefully about fairness, that she counted, that she wrote it down, that she named the work. The hidden work of servant girls in great houses was never as hidden as the great house wanted it to be. It left traces, in wage books and census returns, in worn stone floors and faded carpets, in archives and letters, and the occasional portrait hung on a wall in Wales, in the memoirs of women who refused decades later to pretend that their lives had been anything other than what they were, in the diaries written by candlelight, in the small pots of rosemary on cold windowsills. The traces are there, for anyone who wants to look. Thank you. I mean that with genuine feeling. You stayed with this story. Across 12 parts, across hours you stayed. That is not a small thing. The women we've been talking about tonight spent their lives doing work that was received in silence, work that was acknowledged by its absence when it failed but never properly named when it succeeded. That is not the kind of response that good work deserves. So the fact that you are here, that you listened, that you allowed yourself to be moved or surprised or disturbed or changed even a little by what these women's lives contained, that is a form of seeing. And seeing is where everything else begins. If this story meant something to you, I would be genuinely glad to hear about it in the comments. Not just a like, though. I am grateful for those too, and they help more than you might think. But a word, something you noticed or remembered or thought about, a name you want to add to the ones we've said tonight. And if you have not already, I would love for you to subscribe, because the next story is already waiting. It is another story about people whose work was hidden, whose lives were lived behind the walls of something beautiful, whose names history almost forgot. And I think you're going to want to hear it. Until then, sleep well. And the next time you walk into a clean room or a warm house or a space that someone else has made beautiful for you, take just a moment, look around, and notice what it took.